Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. We always start our talks with the mountain, Snøhetta. And every second year, we climb the mountain with all of our employees, and we gather at Dovre, the mountain plateau in Norway, and have Dovre conversations. And it's just about what you're doing here. It is to gather, build our community, and share our knowledge and our thoughts for the future. Culture grows from the past, but without no culture, you don't have any future. And the culture that we have grown in Snøhetta over the last 30 years is very important to us, and it's all about the people who is there, about the project and our creative processes. And I'm going to share some of that with you here today. Our first project, and the reason for Snøhetta to be established, was winning the Open Architecture Competition for the library in Alexandria in Egypt. And we did that back in 1989 and established Snøhetta as a collaboration based on that. We had a very strong concept, and it was combining a high technology facade, the northern facade, to make sure that we had a good filtering of the lights to the precious books within the studio, and then a stone-cladded wall towards the south. The stone-clad was then made with art symbols. It was letters and languages, no sentences from all of the alphabets around the world. And we worked very thorough together with the local handcraft in order to do that. And our studio moved down to Egypt for a year to follow up on the building site. So it's a key starting point for us. And it was also then very much joyful to actually see then back in 2011, when the revolution and Arabic Spring in Egypt, there was a man protection, really, of this building, because they did not want the library to fall apart and be ruined by the rash that was on, the riots. Starting off with that project back in 1989, it has been, from the very first day, natural for us to go globally, and we've got projects all over the world, and we also are established with studios globally, from the US with New York and San Francisco, in Europe with Oslo, Paris and Innsbruck, and in Asia and Pacific with Hong Kong and Adelaide. This is our studio in Oslo. It's at the harbor, just like here in Helsinki. We're in an old harbor shed, and we sit there with a little bit over 100 people. And as Elizabeth said, we have a transdisciplinary studio with all the disciplines within architecture, graphic design, and product design. And we work very closely together. We like to push ourselves in what we call transpositioning, because you bring your own profession, your discipline, and your personality with you at all times, meaning that you have a lot of capacity to challenge your intellect and actually think in a different manner. You can take someone else's perspective to really understand your colleague, your client, your collaborating team, or the users of what you do. Because what we do as architects as well is not for ourselves, because if we did just buildings that was not filled with the people that would inhabit it, it would be monuments. But we're doing architecture, and that's all about the people. And in order to challenge yourself, you have to not take yourself that personal, or you have to have a lot of humor. You should be able to also share your inner thoughts, because that might be a spark to a brilliant idea that you can use in your collaboration. We do all kinds of creative methodology. We also, of course, draw and sketch, and we invite our clients in. We build models. We share our thoughts with them. We invite them into the creative methodology, and we do project definitions and concepts together with them. And that's all about transdisciplinary ideas, teamwork, and sharing your ideas. This is one of our important values, generosity. You should be generous, both in your projects, but also with how you behave yourself towards your teammates and colleagues and collaborators and clients. The opera in Oslo is a generous concept. We used the site twice. We have a very spacious roof, which is a public plaza, and we invite people to actually have that high cultural building, opera and ballet, as a place where they can go for a stroll on a Sunday. And that has also pushed the borders of what the opera could do. They could invite for concert on the roof, or you could ski. And being able to, push your imagination on what can a building be used for is quite thrilling in the world of architecture. That's also been key for us in New York for the Times Square, where the basic idea is to bring back the public plaza to the people, get life back in the streets. It was massive construction, a lot of frustration on Times Square, obviously, because of the traffic and all the tourists and all of this construction work. We studied the site really carefully in order to understand how the sun is coming in to the site in order to give the right design for the benches, to place them on the actual most sunny spots and give back that seating for people. We even set up mock-ups. It's pretty funny, the man that's actually standing on our bench. But giving public space back to the people and then also furnishing it so that you can spend some time there is important to us to understand what we can use public space for as well as part of a generous concept. You can use it for yoga. In southern France, we have done recently a visitor center for the caves in Lascaux, and it's one of the most popular places in France to go visit. The caves were closed. It's not possible to go and visit them anymore because when you breathe, you destroy the art in there. So we did a complete 3D scan of the original caves. We then remodeled that into a new cave structure. We had 10 artists that painted up the old reindeer and hunting buildings. And then we've done a whole scenography experience on how this art piece, this precious art back from 17,000 years before Christ, came about. And you can have insights and learnings in digital manners, and you can also then explore the actual physical site. And it's a very much a popular destination to go, and now you can also explore then the renovated or new replica of the old cave and have as much of an original experience as you could today. In Innsbruck, we were asked by Swarovski to do a piece in their theme park and at their whereabouts in Wattens, where they produce crystals. It's called Kristallwelten, which is the world of crystals. And we could actually propose what we would like to do. And we said we would like to do a play tower for children. So it's actually a 4-story structure where children and adults can play and explore. And that's important to us as well, to know that you can have buildings that can live with the users that use them. But in graphical design, we won the design of the bills, the new bills in Norway, some years ago, and they're out now with the 50 to the 500. And it's the first time in Norway, or even globally, that you have bills which do not have pictures of people on them. They have a theme. And the theme for this bill in Norway was the ocean. And our concept came about by studying the Beaufort scale, where the speed of wind. And we did then a pixeled side where you can read the speed of the wind from the lowest value on the bill, the 50, up to the 1,000 bill. And as you can imagine, the speed is going faster and faster on the 1,000 bill. The design was selected by the Norwegian bank because it was a very clever design also to do all the security aspects of a bill. So that was key in that as well. Snøhetta has in our portfolio a whole range of projects, as you can see here. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about the project, which is very important to us. It's about the wild reindeer pavilion up in Hjerkinn, where our mountain Snøhetta is. So it's where you can view Snøhetta from. And we did it as a keyless structure. It means it's open for everybody, all year round, all throughout the day. And it's a very simple structure. We studied, as you could see, the old structures of cabins in Norway, and they're quite simple, as they are all over the world. We did then a very easy frame structure, and we did a more technological investigation on our design and our scripting of an amphi indoors, which should be the outer wall and the inner seating. And we did that in the 3D modeling. We also selected then carefully all of the wooden material because we wanted a handcrafted, old structured wooden facade without any nails. And then we tested our 3D modeling and milled that, and we had a boat industry that actually could do the CNC mill in large scale, did that in the old wooden no-nails structure, and mounted it on the site. And as you can see, you have Snøhetta here. From the behind is at a very far destination. It's a wild reindeer area. And you can come there anytime and explore and see the flora and fauna on this mountain plateau. You can be there alone, or you can be there with a group like we are. There's no installations, only a fireplace. The mosques close it. And this year, when we were 170 people, on Dovre Conversations, we then had world record in being the most people in this tiny little pavilion. It's 20 square meters. In Sweden, in Lund, we did a proposal for a synchrotron some years ago. And I'm going to tell you a little bit on that project because it shows how we work also within technology and design in some of our tools. We did first a competition entry. It was this. We didn't win, unfortunately, but we were commissioned as the landscape architects. And since I'm a landscape architect as my profession, even though my work now is as a managing director, I thought it was a good project to show you. So, in our landscape design for this project, we had to carefully do a solution where we could protect the precious synchrotron, where you have electrons going in motions and speeding, that we had to prevent this precious research institute from vibrations in the ground. So we studied then carefully how can we create a landscape design where we're actually preventing the boulder and the disturbances from all of this nearby roads that has then vibrations in the ground that would disturb the research. So we did parametric design through Grasshopper. We studied then all the possibilities we could do in combining lateral waves and radial waves, finding out, okay, can we do combinations of that, and then 3D plotting it to see all these different variations. The basic idea would be, if we found the right altitude, we could then stop vibrations in the ground before it came out into the core, to the center, to the research center. So then, in the end, our design was based on the movement of the particles. We had to combine both the vibration waves from the nearabouts with the movements of the synchrotrons. So we had also then to create the intervals that came from the synchrotron movement and do logarithm curves. And through the parametric design, again, we found the right curved form that could also have been familiar into a landscape shape of it. And then we combine that with the overall other landscape needs we had. And most importantly, we also had to combine this with a massing of the site, so we could make sure that all of the amount of excavated mass from building the research could be handled on the site and redistributed there and be in a total zero extra transport, so a mass balance within. What's interesting, though, when we created this as 3D files, we could even feed that directly into the GPS system in the bulldozers, and they could then use that file directly on site, so we did not have to create any drawings or any explanations on how to do it. You could use the 3D model straight off on the site. And with the GPS technology, you can even study then, as you dug it out, that you were actually in control on the right height of each of the different wave-like structures in here. So that also reduced any misunderstanding, and we had control in real time as well in our digital world. And what was interesting is that it reduced the vibration, and it performs even better than what we calculated and what we scripted and thought about in our digital model, and it has 100% mass balance. So it's quite interesting how you can combine digital and analog and actually give it a physical space as well, and use that throughout all of the different fields, and truly use a digital world to create something as physical as this. The last project I would like to share with you is a tiny little pavilion we did in Singapore for a light festival which was there. And we decided to create a shelter, little structure made out of bamboo and lamps, which are solar lamps. That was given to us by a Business for Peace Foundation in Norway. It's iLight. It's a Norwegian invention of a solar lamp which you can hang. And then we made a simple bamboo structure, hang all of these solar lamps to make that as a ceiling. And after we had that on display in Singapore, we gave away each of these lamps to families in Myanmar in order for them to have that as reading lamps. And in all of our projects, we would like to think about social sustainability and how we can contribute to a greater world, if it is small pieces like this, or if it's in our architecture and what that brings about for people around us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I want to say that I feel really, really honored to be here today on the stage and share our story and adventures until now with you. I'm Sanne, the art director of Envisions, a collective which we started in 2016 in the Netherlands. And it actually started when, with a group of friends, like 9 of us, we thought we want to do it different. At the Design Academy, we were taught to be one of those famous designers like Maarten Baas, Helle Jongerius, or the Boerelek brothers, and that you had to think of a product that would add something to the world or be that incredibly beautiful that everyone wants to buy it. So we sat together and thought of how can we show ourselves in a different way and maybe even start to collaborate instead of just that it's about us as an individual. So with a group of 9 designers, we went to Milan, to Salone del Mobile, and we came up with the idea to only show the process, so not showing the end products, because normally at fairs, for example in Salone, you only see chairs and tables and lights, And probably companies that will visit or even trend forecasters, they will like it or not, but they don't start a conversation with you. So we wanted to do something that maybe people felt inspired or wanted to be part of, and that there was a possibility to have a dialogue with them. So we brought all our process to Milan, and we showcased it in a way that it was not about one of us, but about the complete image. And we started to share the story that we were wishing and dreaming of working together with an industry. Like, what would happen if 9 of us, or even more, would focus on one material? So back in the Netherlands, we had to think of kind of a strategy. How could we reach out to an industry and convince them to start to work with us? So we thought, okay, every product starts with a process, which is that enormous important part for us. That's where magic can happen. So you start to make, and by making you think, and you respond on what's on the table, and you make a next step. But what can an industry do or learn from a process? Then the second step for us is in progress, which means that some of the designers will go into the factories and start to collaborate with the people in the factories. And then hopefully that process in the beginning will end up to production. Finza, it's a Spanish wood manufacturer, they were the first who trusted in us and gave us the freedom to start with this adventure. So they invited us to come to their factory in Spain, where you can see they have enormous amounts of wood chips and woods and a lot of boards. So they normally produce MDF and chipboards, which is maybe a bit of a dull material we probably all use, but we don't give it a lot of value. So most of us will throw it away after it, or it's used, for example, at IKEA products, which don't have a lot of value, and it's not something you will save or keep with you your whole life. So the designers that were part of this were allowed to ask for materials of the factories, which could be the boards themselves, but also the wood chips, glues, or inks. We took it all to the Netherlands, into our own studios, and we started to experiment. So here you can see a glimpse of Simone Post, who is focusing on the wood grains. Like normally, Finns have spent weeks to copy actually a real type of wood into a digital pattern to be able to print it and then put it on top as a melamine on top of the boards. But she was trying to find other ways to make clear it's about wood, but maybe a more graphical statement. This is Ivan Pol. He was inspired by the stiffness of a board and the weight, and what will happen if you can move it, if you can shape it by opening the box. And as you can see, like every single sample is made by hand. Van Tot, they were working with conductive ink, and they were imagining that in the future you maybe can have boards that can lighten up themselves, or where you can plug your iPhone and recharge. But not just a simple plug, but maybe make it more beautiful and part of the board and the pattern. And with all of this, we hope Finza will start to see new possibilities in their products. For example, this is Aukje. A board is normally an impregnated paper, which they press in the heat machine. And by ripping the paper, you can create already patterns without even needing to, copy that wood grain. So you can come up with new ways of creating patterns. And where normally if a paper had it was double, then they would throw it away. And in this way, it becomes valuable again, and you can use it. Robin was trying to make the boards more soft by removing parts of it and then adding textile. And you can imagine that maybe in a hotel or in a restaurant, it can even be an acoustic problem solver, but also you can maybe sit on it and it's more tactile, you want to touch it. Thomas ordered the wood chips and inks, and he rebuilt one of the ovens and the press himself in his own studio to try to color the chipboards before it's pressed. Like normally, they need that extra layer from melamine, but what if you color the board itself? So all different tests came out with beautiful colorways. This is me. I was working on how to connect wood with a focus on the core of the material. It's always a bit difficult to talk about your own work. At that time, we also asked Ol, he's our virtual reality hero, and we asked him to create a world that we could show in Milan where people would be surprised and could maybe better imagine all those small samples in a larger interior. So you really walk into all the handmade samples that we made before. These are some images of the work. I would like to tell a bit more about Roos Gomperts. It's the one next to the colored wood chips. I think what's really important, and it's part of actually all the projects, is that we wanted to bring the knowledge that it's wood and all the technical developments that they do in Finza for this general board, but it's needed to be able to use it in structures and building furniture, that we wanted to show it again, to show that it's wood and not just a fake image or a fake board. So she was removing parts of the melamine to bring back the MDF and the chipboard. This is the work of Simone and Ivan. And then again, we brought it to Milan, but also to different places like New York and London and the Dutch Design Week. The goal of these shows for us is to get feedback, to know what the public will think about it, who is interested in it, and with all that feedback we can start to improve it later on. So we made different setups and to show all the new possibilities. They become small cities or towns where you can believe you walk in or even live in. So then the second part, progress, came. And 6 of us went into the factories and started to collaborate with the R&D, but also the people from production lines. And they didn't know what happened. Like, they normally work already for 25 years, day after day. They do the job as they know it. But now they had the chance to start to play and to communicate with designers that were able and allowed to work with them instead of telling them what to make. So here you can see a veneer. A veneer is a handmade process, so a lot of people are still involved. It's not totally automatic. So we added a certain brush to have stripes on top of all the strokes of veneer, and then you are able to create patterns by choosing which stripe you want to put where. The one next to it is from Aukje. She's the one from the melamine paper, where she ripped it in different pieces. And also here you can see that the MDF becomes part of the pattern. Here you can see the work of Simone Post, who was working on the graphical wood grains. And in this next step, she removed them by a CNC cutter, and it becomes a certain acoustic panel with a depth that you want to touch as well. And the next one is mine, which is all pieces glued to each other to show the core of the board and create a new pattern. Here you can see the work of Thomas, who was working with the colored wood chips. He was allowed to try, for example, confetti, like papers, but also plastics, and he could throw different things in to see how the machines would react on it and if it would really become a part of the chipboard. Also, this step we had to bring to the audience to be able to know if they could imagine to work with it and if they had an idea where they wanted to use it. So we brought it to Milan. And actually here, interior architects and architects, they were like super surprised and like, wow, finally there are new things that we can use and it's not just a plain color anymore. And during Dutch Design Week, like a week ago, we showed it in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And we made use of mirrors to be able to show how it can be endless or even broken and that the pattern can change, to even surprise ourselves again and to come up with new possibilities. So you had to walk in that maze and then you came into a colorful world with all those different patterns. We recently started with ECO. It's a Belgian company. We all know that the plastic is, of course, a topic of today. And we felt we had to do something with it as well. The company is already able to create board materials from recycled plastic, but it doesn't look really appealing. So 10 of our designers worked on the material and made all different tryouts. So this is the first step called process. And for example, like super simple ideas where the top layer of the board is a white kind of non-woven, and one of the designers thought to fold it before it's pressed. So in that way you can create already patterns and you can give some white shades on top of that flakes identity of the board it already has from itself. So in this way we hope to bring our knowledge, but also our ideas into different fields. And the material companies, they start to understand what we can do for them. So with 25 designers from all different backgrounds, there are a lot of material makers, but also graphic designers, architects, photographers, and animation makers. We are working on something new. Because we believe in the world of today, it will be more technology. It's already around us everywhere. So we want to show in 2 years a new step in what we can hopefully do and mean in this new type of world. So we will try to explore and start to communicate with each other. We see each other like every month to share ideas and knowledge. And hopefully we will surprise you in a couple of years with a new show. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for that introduction as well. It's nice to be back in Helsinki. I used to live in Unonliina, a few blocks over there, I guess. So we're going to talk about libraries. I'll introduce these guys in a moment, and Anni will be up first. She'll give us 10 minutes or so. Please find a space. We were wondering how the seating arrangement was going to work, and it's going to work like this. And we have Astrom Zimmer as well, Zurich-based design studio. So Anton Astrom and Lucas Zimmer as well will follow Anni Vartola. Astrom Zimmer, as I said, Zurich-based design studio. We've been talking about their work. I'll let them explain it because it's their work. But I'm particularly interested in their approach because of their combination of art and design and heading into the sort of the ambiguous and the blurry and open-ended practice around things, which is one of the things we know that design can bring to the world. But Anni will be up first. She's a Helsinki-based architecture critic and scholar, and happily for us, she was the curator of the Finnish pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018, where the subject was libraries. So I think without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Anni, to talk through.
Thanks, Dan. Shall I stand up or sit down? Which one do you prefer?
It's whichever one you prefer.
Maybe I sit down, it's more relaxed.
It is, okay, fireside chat.
So, hello everyone, I'm Anni and I'm here today to talk to you about mind building. or more specifically, about the meaning and relevance of libraries, library architecture. Let's begin our journey with this historic image behind me. It takes us to Tampere, the city of Tampere, and this specific place is the Tammela area, workers' class area. This picture was taken in 1907, and you can see the solemn look and very concentrated looks on the readers' faces whilst they're studying their precious newspapers. And you can also see a little detail in the corner of the room. It's the spittoon. We are living at the age of tuberculosis, another terrible disease. And that's also, age of political turmoil. In Finland, the first public libraries were established already in 1794. They were called lukutupa, reading huts. And the purpose of those first libraries was to increase literacy skills, to support democratic participation, and, well, in short, to improve the masses. Now, my question for today to you is to think that if these ideals are still valid. And in order to explore this question, I'd like to take you to Venice, to the mind-building exhibition that we did in the pavilion of Finland at this year's Biennale. And what we did, we showcased some 17 public libraries, or samples of those libraries, built in Finland since 1881. And when I say we, I mean the whole team, the exhibition team who worked for this exhibition. Most importantly, Architecture Information Centre Finland, or Arkinfo Finland, and Commissioner Hanna Harris, whom I think you sit there. Hello, Hanna. And also exhibition architect Tuomas Siitonen and graphic designer Johannes Nieminen, and the whole Arkinfo crew. Let's take a quick tour inside the pavilion so you get an idea what we did. Here's an interior view of this exhibition installation. There's some details we took to Venice, not just images and text about Finnish library buildings, but actual furniture and scale models, lamps, etc. The green book trolley is from Tampere Main Library, Metso, custom designed for the library by Reima and Raili Pietilä in late 1980s. We also had some other custom designed details, such as this historic piece from the pre-Google era, the information gas station, shown here. What does our exhibition title Mind Building stand for? Where did it come from? I derived it from the title from a documentary film, Ex Libris, the New York Public Library by Frederick Wiseman, which I happened to see at Helsinki Dock Point Festival this February. There's a scene of a planning committee having a meeting, and someone says that, but we're not building libraries, we're building minds. So for me, mind building is something similar to bodybuilding, which we know that it's this resistant training to develop our musculature. Mind building is to develop our minds by the use of books, information, literature, all kinds of intellectual challenges to develop our mindsets, our thinking, to increase our brain power, so to speak. And libraries are dedicated activities, dedicated places for that activity, just like gyms are for bodybuilding, libraries are for mind building. The theme for this year's Biennale was free space, and the main curators, Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara, wanted to discuss architecture's innate ability to provide free and additional spatial gifts to those who use it. And their theme, free space, describes a generosity of spirit and a sense of humanity at the core of architecture's agenda. What we did in our mind-building exhibition, we wanted to remind the Biennale audience and you here today that architecture of libraries is at the core of this sense of humanity. our libraries provide a non-commercial, low-threshold indoor public space which is open for everyone, free for everyone, possessed by everyone because it's paid with taxpayers' money and operated for everyone's benefit. I'm personally reminded of this by the award-winning Aalto University Learning Centre, which I use for my academic work almost daily because I work as a senior lecturer of theory of architecture at that school. And so the library is more than just a space for book collections. Where does this societal mission of our library architecture actually come from? Well, in terms of Finland, we owe much to this woman, Valfrid Palmgren. She's a Swedish librarian, and she made a study tour into the United States at the beginning of the 1900s. Her travel notes were quickly translated into Finnish, and they underlined the importance of library buildings in the promotion of the progressive program called the Library Movement. It was very active in the US and also in Britain during the last decades of the 19th century. So let's hear what Valfrid has to say to us. The public library is the spiritual center of the community. Beautiful architecture, both in the exterior and the interior, and the best possible site are a necessity, because the library is a meeting place for all societal classes alike, from generation to generation. Through its collections, the enchanting atmosphere of the interior, the warmth and the light inside the library says welcome to each and every member of the society and make them feel at home. This fundamental ethos of library is still present, and this is what we wanted to demonstrate in our mind-building exhibition and its library samples. May it be a modern urban oasis for literature lovers, such as this Töölö library in Helsinki by Arne Ervi from the 1970s, so insightfully renovated by Tapani Mustonen architects in 2016. Or may it be a complete postmodern work of art, such as the Kuhmo Town Library by Jyrki Tasa from 1988. Or may it reside in our everyday surroundings, such as this Sello Library in Espoo by Helin Architects, which is basically an appendix to a huge shopping mall and cultural complex. Or may its challenge be to completely modernize the local library services in dialogue with the monumental cultural complex like the Alvar Aalto Center in the city of Seinäjoki. This is the case with the Seinäjoki Main Library Apila by JKMM Architects from 2012. Or then may it be a completely new translation of the meaning of the public library of the 21st century in the Finnish context, like the soon-to-be-opened Helsinki Central Library Oodi. So what makes Oodi so special today for us? To begin with, the whole Oodi and other architects, they've listened seriously what librarians have to say in Finland and elsewhere. Library user behavior has changed dramatically. Instead of lending books or DVDs or stuff, people use library spaces for working, co-working, meetings, lecture events, discussions, and to get access to digital services, public services. So other architects have listened to this, and their design for Oodi reflects this. For example, through its location, it could not be more prestigiously positioned within the city of Helsinki. It's right there in the center. And secondly, Oodi concretizes the fact that an open society means that everyone feels at home and everyone is welcome to use information. Everyone has equal access. May that information take whatever form, a printed book, a formal stream of data in the cloud or whatever, embedded in the skills or know-how to craft, to make something. And Oodi also accepts that our libraries act as a counterforce for the increasing privatization and commercialization of our urban space. So the public library of the 21st century supports social life and active societal participation. And in Oodi, how other architects have made this real. This shows in the example in the ample amount of hang-around spaces, workrooms, rentable event spaces, and so forth. And most importantly, Oodi and how the third floor and its terrace face the Parliament building puts the policymakers and the library users on the same level so that they look each other in the eye. What could be more powerful a symbol of our new Public Library Act, which explicitly says that the purpose of public libraries is to promote active citizenship, democracy, and lifelong learning. Yeah, the third floor is appropriately titled Book Heaven. What we book lovers will be enjoying is a boldly magnificent space of 4,500 square meters dedicated for literature. Books and quiet reading are still the crown jewels of the modern library. Peter Eisenman, a well-known American architect and theorist, has said that a book lasts longer than a building. And I agree, I work with books all the time. Architecture is framed by its theory in architecture. Books have always been crucial to the architecture culture. Peter Eisenman argues that all architecture is about ideas, whether it's on paper or built. So I'd like to translate Eisenman's thoughts from architecture literature into the architectural language of public libraries. Their architecture reveals that the ultimate meaning of free space, the freedom of the mind to think, to learn, to dream, and to make progress, the necessity of mind building. So Finland has changed a lot during the 20th century, but people still yearn for knowledge, information, new skills, new ideas, new stimuli for creativity and innovation, whatever form that takes and whatever incentive it calls for. And the library is there to say welcome and make you feel at home. Thank you. You're welcome.
Anton, to talk about your work.
Thank you very much. I'll stand up if that's okay with everyone.
Sure.
I think I speak easier when I can move around. That's us. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, first of all, for having us. Thank you to Anni. I am Anton Astrom, or Anton Åström, for the Nordics in the audience. I am half of Astrom Zimmer. The other half is Lucas, right there, next to me. We're a small design studio in Zurich. We're working cross analog and digital. We're working mainly with cultural institutions, but also in university research projects, a lot with archives, process documentation, trying to create interfaces that kind of span the bridges, analog and digital, in different ways. Today, as part of the library design panel, we'll present a project called Werkbank. And it's something we did at location Sitterverk in St. Gallen. And just a short kind of background story. Sitterverk used to be an industrial area, or area complex. It's now been refactored, and it houses an art foundry. There's artist studios there, the photo lab. There's a book binder. There's a dance studio, I think, next door. There's kind of a melting pot of everything cultural. For our purposes, there's also an art library. So this art library consists of two main areas. So there's, on the left side, you see the material archive. This is mainly specimens from the foundry process, but it's also it's also part of the Swiss National Material Archive, which is a network of different institutions. And then, of course, you have the book part, right? The libraries. And the main bulk of this book, it's a collection that comes from this guy Daniel Rohner. He was a collector of artist books and catalogs, who, towards the end of his life, donated all his books to Sitterverk and thus became the art library. Daniel had a very special relationship to his books. He couldn't stand being separated from them for very long. So he would spend most of his last years in the library in Sitterverk, kind of making collections and reading lists for visiting artists. He would rearrange the books on the shelves. He had all these kind of organizing private subjective ordering structures. One of my favorite was that he would place books next to each other of or about artists that in life had some kind of dispute with each other. So he would kind of make it all right. As you can imagine, this is a very tricky process or a tricky situation to deal with from a library kind of catalog point of view. So what the team at Sitterverk did, they teamed up with I'm going to skip to the next slide. Teamed up with a company called Infomedis, specialist in RFID technology, and they created a system consisting of, first of all, a table where you could kind of lay out your books and create these reading lists in the spirit of Daniel. And you could do this because all the books were tags with RFID chips, right? And the second part was this robot that kind of continuously flies over the shelves and scans the books. And what this enables you to do is kind of move very freely. This is a still from a video by an artist called Ded Davis, who was visiting the Cityvec, who illustrated the kind of movement, free movement of books within the library. So you could take books out, you can do your research, you can take them all together and put them back somewhere else in the library. And they would still always be findable. Here is an image of the Infomedis guys working hard. This is this reading list table. So this is the basic, right? You have the system to manage the stuff that's already in the library, the stuff that's part of the art library. And our question was, how do, like everything that's being produced in the library with this material, with these books, how can we make that flow back into the collection, right? So Cityvec is a place of production and also in the library very much a place of knowledge production. So we sat down with the Cityvec team, we worked hard and intense for a while, and together with Fabian Weckmüller, a co-conspirator from Zurich, we created the Werkbank, or the workbench in English. As you see, it's a research desk. It's a place where you sit and you do your stuff. It's a very physical space. You take your books out, take materials out, you put them out in front of you, you move them around, you read things, you write notes, and this is a very kind of crucial part of this feeding back to the library that we were talking about, the knowledge creation, right? We believe that the way that you lay things out around you, the way that you move them around, is very much part of how you then create, how you internalize things and create knowledge out of information. And then to let this feed back into the system, this table has a couple of tweaks. Underneath the RFID antennas, you remember the books and the materials all have these tags. So we're able to kind of track where the books are on this working space at any given time. On top, there's also 2 cameras, actually. So one of them is continuously doing image recognition, and then kind of more precisely aligning books. So if you kind of turn a book around, the camera sees that, and it can track that. The second camera is for you to make photographs of notes or specific pages in the books. And then there's this digital thing you see there on the screen to the right. So this is where all this kind of stuff can be taken into a more abstract space. And if we dive in, you see you have a kind of a representation of whatever you're doing currently on the table. At any given moment, you can save that into a digital collection and then work in a more kind of digital way with the material. So you can move these things around, you can scale them, you can rotate them, you can change the background, you can organize things in kind of these knowledge maps. And of course, you can kind of look closer at one of the books. I'm curious about this Fantasies in the Library, and I'm curious about, of course, these books and materials have also been used by other people and maybe been part of other collections. If you look at the top left corner there, you see 6 related collections. That means that these books have been integrated, have been contextualized by 6 other people. So if I expand that, and then I choose, for example, the New York one, I can see who made that, what else is in that collection. I can see what I have in common with it currently on the table. I can then go and visit it, and then I see that specific piece that I was interested in, but within a new context. Then, of course, this is all digital and in kind of this more abstract area. How to make this flow back into the physical space is a good question. We have one suggestion, which is these bibliozines, right? So you can drag and drop books or notes onto kind of a page layout. You get a visual representation, you get kind of metadata on the side, you can add notes, and you can print this out, you can fold it up, you can staple it together, and you can create these research booklets out of this stuff that can then be put back into the shelves and be discovered by other people. So this is where we see Werkbank in this context. It's very much a research project. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a suggestion, and it lives somewhere there between the material and the books, between the analog and the digital, between the people, their research, and the space in which they do their research. Thank you.
Tack, Anton.
Varsågod.
Thank you so much, both of you. That's fascinating already. When talking about libraries, it's so actually heartening to have something like the subject of libraries at a conference like this. I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, it would be hard to imagine that. I was working with clients and collaborators then, sometimes major libraries, who were asking me to do pieces of work, basically assuring them that the library had a future. In the age of the internet at that point. And 10, 15 years later, we can see actually, as you've just seen through this kind of work, actually library futures are more powerful than ever, in a sense. Around the world, visitor numbers are going up to libraries, up and up and up repeatedly, except in the UK where they're closing them down. But anyway, there's another reason why for that. So it's almost as if we need these places for sense-making, which is something we talked about beforehand, more than ever, because of the internet, to some extent, because of digital services and things like this, and because of the different currents of information we have to deal with now. The library, as Anni said, as an open, civic, public space where you can go to make sense of the world, actually now seems more vital than ever. So it's incredibly heartening to see it at the heart of a conference like SPAN, actually. So to jump into some of the questions that both of your work, I think, throws up, and maybe I'll start with you guys, Lucas and Anton, if that's okay. This system that you built here is a sort of an installation or provocation, but also looks like a real tool that I'm sure everybody wants to use tomorrow. And anybody working in libraries, you can go and talk to them afterwards. What's fascinating about that is it plays with, if you like, the kind of dynamics of a digital system, like the ability to enable users to collaborate with each other directly in a sort of, let's call it just a disintermediated way, as in my collection speaks to your collection, speaks to your collection, almost direct through your tool in that sense. And we can come back to the importance of doing it physically in a space in a moment, because I think that's something that we'd like to talk with you about as well. But where do you see then the role of the librarian or the curator within that system? So you have library as a space, and you have the books, and then you have the people, and you built a system which threads those together. How did the librarians or the role of the curator act within that? Do they still have a place in that kind of system, do you think?
I think it depends a lot on what kind of library we're talking about. When we talk especially about the Zitterwerk library, I mean the table and this system allows to open up this library or to have specific highlights or perspectives on certain books or constellations. And I think one part of the librarian is, of course, also like to curate in this way a bit like who is working there. They are also inviting people who work there, people they think are interesting perspectives also. I think one part is this. And
it's also special in the sense that kind of going back into that specific institution, but it's also the special place because they do exhibitions within the library, and the librarians and the people dealing with the material archive, they're actually also curators of exhibitions. So they do in this space thing. So and in that sense, the tool, the Werkbank specifically, is a very democratic thing because it's being used by the visitors, just kind of browsing through things. For researchers are doing very focused stuff, but also the librarians creating kind of exhibition catalogs for these scenes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating because of this interplay between code and people, in a sense, and the variation in the patterns that humans put in because of the idiosyncrasies of humans and the connections that a human might make Weirdly, it reminds me of Spotify's Discover Weekly playlist, if anybody uses that, which is this effectively auto-generated playlist you get every Monday, which in a sense is the result, you could say, of machine learning crunching, millions and millions of plays on Spotify, of course. But because they use the human-generated playlist as one of the core ingredients within that, then it makes these quite illogical sometimes or quirky relationships between songs that you would never see on, say, let's say pure Amazon collaborative filtering type system. It begins to pull in machine learning and human learning and crunch them together. And it sort of feels like the ability of the curator and the librarian and the users is to constantly interrupt the system with something from left field. Is that in terms of exhibitions, or as you say, who's in the library in the first place, the objects that they're working with? Is that the kind of principle you were playing?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's the system in itself is not there's no algorithm running kind of producing output in a sense, but it's in some ways I think just by defining this rule set, this framework, these specific set of tools that are very simple. It's a very simple, so the way you put things out, you can add notes or things, but the way you move things around the library, the way you lay them out, is kind of the basic representation of the knowledge that you're building. It's very simple.
Yeah.
But I think with all these, whenever you make rules, you kind of guide people. You create these walls for people to bounce against, right? So you create these frictions, and you create these areas in which things happen, right? Energy is transferred.
Yeah, and I think it's important when you talk about this playlist that gets generated. I mean, this example of Sitterwerk is really from the beginning on. It's like we work a lot we try to implement a lot of, you can say, friction or things that are not that quick as they could be, probably because you have to walk 20 minutes to this library. You have the space. You have to walk and get a book.
Yeah.
You have to make the decision on the table. How close are they related? So I think this is an interesting part that you really consciously have to make decisions all the time, and it's not just flooded, or you get not flooded with things. I think this makes it interesting if we talk also what you talked about, mind building, or I think this,
Yeah, I mean, Anni, when it came to the new Oodi library in Helsinki, which opens next month or so, you should go and see the site if you're in town, just to get a sense of the scale of it, as a statement from the city to the citizens, or vice versa, about the importance of mind building and the importance of, let's say, slow information as well as fast information, or slow knowledge building as well as fast. How do you see those patterns played out in the design of the library? The design of libraries is complex because they have to sort of almost do everything. Yeah. How do they layer the experience there in terms of slow and fast and public and civic?
Oh, well, in terms of Oodi, first of all, it's if I just quickly explain the structure, it's in 3 floors. The first floor is dedicated for public services and all these hang-around meeting spaces. There's a restaurant and movie theatre, all sorts of activities are not that traditionally libraric, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
The second floor is for making stuff. Makers studios, from audio engineering to sewing machines or 3D printing or weaving or whatever you want to make. There's the facilities and also the personnel for you to help you out. And then the third floor is for books and literature. So that's somehow the ground floor, where it's the immediate access to the urban texture of Helsinki. That's the sort of the handshake to everyone. Just come on in, and you don't. If you are a bit afraid of books or reading anything that's not your thing, you can still go to the library. You feel it's easy.
Yeah.
And in terms of just coming back to what you talked about, the role of the librarian. You see the change there, and I was just some 3-4 weeks ago visiting Aarhus in Denmark, where the new library Dock 1 it's been a model for Oodi in some sense. And they have the role of the librarian has completely changed already a decade ago, because they're not just cataloging books or pushing them back to the shelves, but because there's the technology for it, the RFID ID tagging. But what they do is they meet the customers. They want to know what are you interested in, and if you're interested in making yourself a new bag, then they take you into the sewing studio. Or if you have small kids, maybe you want to learn about their storytelling hours, etc. So there are multiple roles for the librarians today. So we really have to let go of that old, the stern-faced elderly woman who was saying you should not.
They have their place.
Yeah, they do. They still do. Yeah,
they're very important as well. But yes, no. But I think the shift from in a public library anyway, from what we call them shush libraries,
exactly,
to something more vital and alive. I mean, it really strikes me that almost the librarian role you just described there is a bit like the system that you guys have built, as in it's sort of the librarian you can imagine across these 3 floors, kind of shuttling information and artifacts from the 3rd floor down to the 1st floor to make something happen in a public space, then to learn from that and then almost filter the knowledge back up through the... Is that the sort of thing you can almost see the libraries working almost like the code in Werkbank in that way?
And I studied some excellent videos on YouTube to see how the RFID technology works, and that's exactly that. We leave technology to take care of that, and we don't have to give that much room for bookshelves, etc., because the material takes care of itself.
Yes.
But this leaves room for people to interact and to talk about books and to give you book tips and reading tips. The same thing that happens in commercial life. If you go to a bookshop, it's not by accident that you have those particular titles on display at that day, because the role of the salesperson personnel is to get tips about what's the talk of the town and what's on the news today and what's the top film. Maybe there's a book about it, so that to tease you to read and to buy it, and that's the same phenomenon is coming to libraries.
Absolutely.
as well.
And I think again with both of your projects, then it's almost like the best use of both what you talked about, the digital media, or digital systems, digital services, are then accentuating the things that they do best, as in correlating between RFID tags is something that tech can do very well. And the great thing about that, then, is that it's freed up people to do what people do very well, whether it's the curator you talk about at Sittenberg who set the whole thing up, or the librarian described. So what it's not doing is replacing that person. No. It's not taking the person out of the loop. It's humans and tech working together in a symbiotic way, each playing to their own strengths.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
So, go on, Anton.
But it's also a big challenge, of course. We talk about the role of the librarian. I see it very much as a guide, right? Kind of a guide to this space, which is the library, and the space, which is the library, has changed very much. So the guiding, like the task of the guide, in that sense, also changes very much. And it's super challenging, of course, finding not only from the outside you have to redefine this space, which is in the library, but from the inside you have to redefine. Like how much do I touch everything? How much do I guide? How much do I force things? How much do I shush or send people downstairs or whatever? And technology is a big part of this, of course. If you introduce a new technology, it's like either it helps you to do something you did before, it makes you more efficient, or it makes you obsolete, or it makes you lost.
Yeah.
So, exactly.
And how much of your work was a kind of a provocation to ask that question? As opposed, you could look at your work and say, someone else might say, well, there's a product. Or was it a provocation? Like, where are you on that spectrum with your work out of interest? You don't have to.
No.
This is an existential question.
I think everything builds on this. So RFID is ubiquitous now in libraries, right? It's used everywhere in every. It's check-in, check-out system. It's a location system. The dynamic ordering stuff that was made in Sittenberg was, I think they started doing this in 2005 or 6 or something. So it was very early, and there were no prototypes for how to do it. Like there was no. That solved a very specific problem at that location, which was this guy, Daniel, who came in and reorganized everything all the time. Yeah. So it came out of that, and then for us, I think very much it was about seeing this technology, which was there as a problem solver for something very specific, and then kind of just turn it around, see what else can we do with it.
Yeah.
Just kind of turn this upside down and see what happens.
Yeah.
It's not so much as a provocation as like you have to do it differently, but more like, I wonder what happens if you do it like this.
Yeah, and you really have to develop it and touch it to see what it makes with you. It's very difficult to theorize about this, about the outcome. You really have to see it, and then
I mean, that's one thing we know that design can do is make things tangible, make things it's like a synthetic approach. It's not just analysis saying you could do these things with RFID chips because they exist, and here's the role of librarian up until now. Here's a report about that. But you synthesize, you make something and put it in front of people, and then you can say, well, here's an example, or you could do it like this, or you could do it like this. So is that, with your practice, are you trying to make these things in that sense, to make concrete these philosophies in some way?
Yeah, definitely. I think we have also other tools that we develop, and we call them interactive ideas to really talk about these things. And of course, you can go there and touch this, but I mean, we could not export this table immediately to other locations. It's a prototype and it's
located there.
Yeah. But I think it's very important to develop things also just for discussing it and working as a prototype for this.
So maybe one closing question to both of you in a way. If you were to build a Werkbank in Helsinki, in the new library you described, how would it change? So, because that seems very located in St. Gallen, in that particular curatorial practice from the guy who started it. Clearly, we can all imagine it could work somewhere else. So I'm interested to know how you would answer that. And then from your point of view, Anni, how do you see those kinds of systems enhancing the way that, say, a Finnish public library could work in some sense? You've surveyed almost all of them, and in Finland, we know that more people go to public libraries, I think, per capita than anywhere else in the world. So some of that is snow, for sure. But some of that is also to do with the love of libraries in some deep cultural level. So, could you imagine these Werkbank-like system, in a sense, incorporate into Odeon and how that would change Odeon?
Oh, definitely, because I think the strength of the
the
bench. Because because you have these tangible material things, and the table. It's so tangible, and it's so easy to understand that this is a table, this is my material, and suddenly it turns it into a digital form of digital information. So the threshold to use that is so easy, and so it comes naturally. So I would very much like to see it, especially in the maker spaces, and if you use some other material, etc. So you make the bridge your ideas and the books, etc. But in terms of the RFID technology, we have already that kind of in a similar sense that you have these smart shelves, that you have the book there, and if you put it there or take it away, then it displays some more information about the author and what other book reviews, etc. Yeah. So if the user responses could be added to that, would be excellent to give that to take that life, the user, the reading experience of everyone's, to incorporate that into that set of information about books.
Which again feels, not to overplay the Finnishness, but there is a sort of a democracy at the core of the way that Finnish culture works, in its terms of its flatness on purpose, and as with the Nordic regions generally. That would absolutely make sense in that context. Yeah, so, and just to speculate briefly, you guys, what would be your thought process or design process about taking that kind of principle and dropping it into Finland in some way?
Should I? I have two kind of main questions that I would start to kind of deal with. One of them is mode, right? So you have different layers in this library. You have different modes of focus, or different modes of engagement. And I think the Werkbank is one piece of furniture in one location. I think a system like that would have to be very kind of tailored to different modes of being. Yeah. So if you're on the go, if you're with other people, if you're in conversation, if you're focused, deep reading, whatever, like something that's much more modular, you can kind of tailor to your own where you are right now. And then I think the second bit is where, again, kind of mirroring that location into another space would be the transparency of things. So you see all the cables and everything hanging out, and it's very RFID technology is very simple. It's radio waves. So it's something that you can touch and you can deal with. You can kind of look at it and go like, all right, and then it comes out like this. And I think that would also be very, very important. That there's some kind of you can see the skeleton of the whole system working, and you would understand what you're doing when you interact with it.
Yeah, I think this is the nice thing, maybe the closing. But libraries make these processes visible and tangible. They make either systems of democracy or systems of knowledge, which are otherwise abstract, very tangible and physical. So, okay, I think we have to leave it there because I think we're out of time. But thank you very much, Anton Astrom, Lukas Zimmer, Anni, Vartola.
Thank you, Dan.
Tak, danke, kiitos. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for watching. I hope you had a quiet moment to reflect on an inspiring and long day. This video was shot, we like to joke that it took a long time to render all those leaves, but it's actually a drone run from one end of Punkaharju Ridge, about 3.5 hours east of here by train. There's about 3 more minutes to go, but we thought we'd get started. It's a video for a remix of a song by my band with Nadia Peak, who's one of the leading researchers in the world in personal digital fabrication. And it's appropriate for a design conference because this band would not exist except for a very large CNC mill at MIT Media Lab where we met. We also play real instruments live. This was recently in Moscow. And the track from the remixes. The band is called Construction, and the EP is called Set, available everywhere on the digital celestial jukeboxes. In addition to music, we also work on other projects, typically related to design. This is a museum and cultural institution being built in Moscow. I'll talk a little bit more about that, called Guest 2, and also on the construction site. But as was said in the introduction, I've recently started as artistic director of the Helsinki Festival, which is the largest multi-arts festival in the Nordics. We reach about 200,000 people. It's in the second half of August every year. Multi-arts means music, performing arts, visual arts, the full mix. And I'll talk a little bit about, we agreed when I was happy to get the invitation to address you, is share some very early thoughts after 2 months doing something I have never done before, basically how to design a festival. But before that, since you are in my hometown, I'd like to, for those that have traveled from afar and are not living here in Finland, to give you a few Finnish lessons and just to introduce the country and its culture. The first thing to say is Finland is kind of a Nordic oddity. We are not as smooth as our royal Western Swedish cousins. We only recently moved into the cities. This is the kind of thing we send to the Eurovision Song Contest. I mean, we're a monster metal band, and then we win. The second theory it's a theory of cultural competitiveness of the Finnish people that my father favors, which is that Finns excel in activities requiring helmets. And it says something about the calmness under pressure, I suppose. Formula One, ice hockey, UN peacekeeping, if you like, rally driving. This, of course, is ice hockey, the airwave, a phenomenal move, a historic move in one. But in addition to helmets, then there is silence and nature. As I said, we only recently moved into the cities. And as such, almost in every family, there is a place in the country where you retreat to during the summer season in particular. And this is an image, let's see, of a while back, our country house by the lakeside. And it's this connection between being comfortable with silence and the nature, I think, persists still. I'm the son of 2 teachers, and learning, of course, the Finnish school system is well known. It's also well known for its effects, but most of the techniques used are quite contrary to many in other schooling systems. There's very little policing of teachers or standardization of tests, much more autonomy. Teaching is a key and valued profession, and this is the only graph you'll see, but basically this is continued. I think most of the education community now in Finland is saying, well, this won't continue, and so we need to do all of the investments for the next 30, 40 years in structure and innovate in the system and do that together with other countries. And finally, we were recently formally announced by a UN survey to be the happiest country in the world. This was a report it's based on one question. It says something maybe about learning, and the Finnish psyche is that the first Finnish overall reaction was, there must be something wrong with the methodology. But that's enough for Finnish lessons, and I hope the Finns and the people living in Finland recognize that. Very quickly, a few things about my path. To my practice and my work. I'm self-taught as an interaction designer. I said philosophy, and then through twists and turns, this was, in a way, my first proper startup together with Matt Bidoff and Matt Jones, who's at Google currently, called Doppler, which is a proto-Foursquare for the world's most frequent travelers. Very much child of that period of the web, an interconnected service to many other services, did a few things extremely well. This was a map of all the cities that the travelers were visiting after a few days. This company was then acquired by Nokia, and I was head of the design studio there, industrial design, UX design, and packaging design, and really crafted an extreme industrial scale. So learned a great deal from my colleagues there. We also published a book, and thanks to Dan Hill, who's I think still here, for writing a wonderful intro to it. It's by Gestalten, which in a way puts the context of what we're trying to do in the studio in the broader context of Finnish design. After Nokia, I went to the MIT Media Lab and focused very much on health and well-being, initially of the student community and of MIT. It's a high-pressure, very creative environment. And through several surprising coincidences, met people to start a company working called Sync Project, working on personalized music as a therapeutic, essentially, for different health conditions, for sleep disorders and acute pain. So this was generative, algorithmically generated sound and music personalized to the individual and their physiology with the goal of relaxing them. A key personal influence in my life has been the current director of the Media Lab, Joey Ito, whom some of you may know. And particularly one quote which I think is relevant for some of the things I'll discuss about festivals is that he always says this: I don't like the word futurist, I think we should be nowist, focus on being connected, always learning, fully aware, and super present. Sync Project was acquired in February by Bose Corporation, a Boston-based American company, makes noise-canceling headphones and investing heavily in health. And at that point, I was able to return to Finland. One of the first projects I was lucky to get involved with is actually not in Finland. It's a new cultural center, which I mentioned in the picture with Nadia Peek and I, called Guest 2. It's a cultural center built in the former power plant of the Kremlin. It's a multi-art center, including a factory for artists. If you see on the left-hand side in the vaulted structure there, full digital fabrication and audiovisual facilities, and really a very multifunctional space, working together with Renzo Piano Building Workshop and Experimental Jet Set on the digital infrastructure of this institution, which is very interesting when you can do it from scratch. I'll come back to that a bit in the last topic. But so to a festival, a day of celebration, typically of religious reasons, or an organized series of concerts, plays, or films, in the case of the Helsinki Festival. So a few thoughts about what is relevant today. The Helsinki Festival was started 50 years ago. I think of it as us designing the first 5 years of the next 50, the moment. When it started, and even 25 years ago, there were no other urban festivals really in Helsinki. Now there are ones every day, every other weekend. We get proposals every day from extremely good, bright people saying, we'd like to do another festival within your festival. So I don't know what it is about. Of course, it's driven by people's interest in art and culture. But I'll highlight 3 topics. One is very much based on my experience at Sync Project, music as medicine. Then the topic of synchronization and liveness in experiences. And then some thoughts about what a new social contract for data could be driven by cultural institutions. So first of all, music as medicine. Now I use it provocatively this way. That's the way we spoke of it at Sync Project, but effectively looking at the health and well-being effects of art, but music in particular. Music is a particular thing. Culturally, first of all, it's a big human universal. We all self-medicate with music. One of the stories that I think is most revealing of this is then candidate Barack Obama, before going into the debates, would always listen to the same track of music. It was the last thing, the earbuds was the last thing to come out before he walked onto the debate stage. You may wonder what track this was. This was Eminem's Lose Yourself. So opportunity comes once in a lifetime. And Eminem's Lose Yourself may not be your track, it's not my track. I have a few other tracks, which are also good. You have your tracks, that's the point. It's a personalized medium. And so we have a lot of anecdotal and personal, visceral experience of music's effect on us. It makes us move, not only moves us, but then the neuroscience is catching up to this. It turns out music listening fires the brain very broadly. It affects many of the pathways in the brain that psychostimulants, in other words, drugs, affect. So maybe there's some truth to this. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Why are these related? Why is addiction combined? But without going there, those are in a way very light, broad statements. It is true that we're starting to understand the effect of music on dopaminergic circuitry. And in fact, even on pain, I'm not showing it here, but there's a meta-analysis of over 4,000 studies looking at the effect of music in an acute pain setting. And if you really whittle it down, about 73 of those studies are randomized control studies. We then continued in making studies both in terms of adoption in a healthcare setting as well as on the efficacy. This is just one concept paper related to some studies that were underway. And I think the key thing to say is take 10, 15 years, I think it will be completely standard for us to include sensory stimulus like this as a part of a normal health regime. So in addition to the sort of knockout punch, small chemical, harder medical interventions, we'll be able to complement those with different forms. Music is the one that I understand the best. So then the question is, what does any of this have anything to do with the festival? Well, I think thematically we will bring health and well-being and the health and well-being effects of art broadly into the festival. One thing we are looking at is starting the festival with an 8-hour piece by Max Richter called Sleep. It's a piece that starts in... Has anyone slept in this piece or heard it? Yes. So it's an 8-hour piece that starts at 11 p.m., ends at 7 a.m. It's a beautiful moment right there in the morning because there's almost no high end in the piece. And then just as the morning is coming and you're getting ready to wake up, the high end comes in and it's almost like the sky opens up. So there's a festival tent that we build every year. And we plan to put 100 beds in the tent, and then lots of tiny tents across the waterside there, so you can have your own little festival tent with your loved one if you'd like, sleep or not. Of course, most sleep researchers would say that with any sound is not conducive to sleep other than white noise to block out an environment that's already noisy. And this is a meditation on wakefulness, so not to take it purely as a health intervention. It is a piece of art that was composed to the cycles of sleep based on understanding of how sleep cycles work on the whole. We're also planning to put ambient visual art into those places where people arrive in and leave Helsinki. This is the new Port of Helsinki T2 terminal where you go to Tallinn. 6,000 people go through this space every day. When the ships are half full, over 10,000 every day. And music for airports is, of course, a nod to Brian Eno, the person that started much of this. So in these ways, we'll bring it in, not in a way that everyone will need to be decked out in sensors and will need to prove that. It's also not the case that art needs to be ever justified, in my belief, by a non-artistic value. It is a human fundamental and a cultural value for us. But I think many people are interested in these health effects, particularly in a very busy and hectic and environmentally stressful time. The other topic is synchronization, and by this I mean is anything that synchronizes people and our attention in these days is highly valuable, I believe. That's good for festivals because that's what they are. They focus our attention together on something. But really, if you look at most of the media environment and the tools that we use on a daily basis, many of them fragment our attention. We are in our own little bubbles, and this experience of being at something and watching it together is relatively rare. That is one of the values of today's gathering. Esa-Pekka Salonen, who was a previous artistic director of the festival and LA Philharmonic chief conductor, now with the London Philharmonia Orchestra, he recently turned 60 years old, and in an interview at the festival actually says maybe that's one thing classical music has going for it, is people stop at it and listen to it and actually pay attention, and that something is happening, particularly at this moment, in that being valued. It's not really classical music alone. I don't know how many of you know William Basinski, who's a sound artist. He was just plays quite ambient, slowly moving, beautiful music. I didn't know how big he was. I've loved his music, water music and disintegration loops and other things. He played at the Temple Square Church, Temppeliaukion kirkko, on Tuesday night. And so there's not too much happening in this music compared to, let's say, Mahler 8 again. And it was totally packed, and for 45 minutes I didn't see a single light from a blue screen. So I think this sense of presence, of course, has been a theme. Marina Abramovic, as the artist is present, is perhaps the most famous. You just go sit and you spend a moment. And so what at the festival we will do, we'll take both very large contexts. We typically have an evening together with our partner festival called Art Goes Kapakka, that brings art into all of the bars and pubs of Helsinki. Over 350 very, very high quality, usually fairly risky performances, meaning first time doing something for an audience. But we started off with a huge choir concert, typically 2,000 to 3,000 people singing together, which in and of itself has positive neurological effects for those that participate. But I don't think it's only good to do XXL things, XXL being 1.5 orchestras, 3 choirs, 5 elephants at the music hall, 1,600 people watching. Pick your favorite romantic piece between 1850 and 1920. That's important, but I think what is interesting is also to zag the other way and go as small as possible. We found some spaces, and we'll do many secret. Helsinki is and I actually am thankful for Dan Hill for once saying this to me, is Helsinki reveals its beauty through the secret spaces and by going into it. And so this first scene is actually the underbelly of the National Opera. It's the space, it's kind of like a Terminator space below the stage. But you can fit 300 people in there and listen to a string quartet. And the other is Alvar Aalto's home. Now, finally, a topic which I'll only touch on briefly, but I'd hope if you have interest in this, please come talk to me after the show, because it's something I'm thinking about very much. And this is in both the context of the Guest 2, the cultural institution being built in Moscow, as well as the Helsinki Festival. It's, can a cultural institution play a significant role in a new kind of social contract for data with the audience and with the visitors? I was struck by the Venice Biennale theme of free space, but free space digitally is nearly non-existent, and the dominant business models of the internet, particularly as they relate to social applications and communication, are free services predicated on surveillance with advertising. I use those words not in a normative way, I'm just saying that that's what it is, and that's an explicit model. If we look now forward, is how could an art institution, and this is purposefully written by hand, how could there be a new kind of social contract for data? Be radical transparency of methods and tools. What are we collecting about you when you are here? What are we tracking and why? What kind of training sets are we using? And who has access to this data? There will be surveillance. There's always security. How is it anonymized? How is that data anonymized? What are we doing on that regard? If we do identify you, what permissions are we asking for you, and what is that value exchange in terms of that? And if you decide to be identified when you leave, you should be able to take what you have. But then, of course, there will always be a trace of that data. These are topics that many people have thought in this audience deeply about. And finally, I think it's interesting to allow that data, which visitors and audience members have allowed to be used as a material for artists. All of this needs to be a process. How is that updated over time? And I think this is very interesting that perhaps cultural institutions can show a path forward of a different kind of relationship with our data. So with that, I'd just like to wish you all welcome next year in August. Those of you that are here visiting, please come back. I think the festival will also, over the next few years, convene a dialogue around art, ethics, and artificial intelligence in the way that we think we can. And any of you interested in that, please be in touch with us. I think it's a role that we could play. And with that, thank you very much.
Which way do you want to stand?
I'll stand here. Thank you for the lovely introduction.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's lovely to be here. First of all, thanks for Google for choosing Helsinki to be this year's venue for SPAN. It's an honor, and it's an honor to be also on the stage today. And thanks, Marko, for briefing Finland so beautifully. We don't have to say anything anymore. We can just talk about our work, which is great. We are going to talk today a little bit about sensations, frictions, experiences, and cultural change. But before going into the topic, we'll give you a brief overview of who we are and what type of work we do. I am Tuuli. This is my brother Kivi. And together we are Ateljé Sotamaa. We have a small international staff, and they are mostly here actually today as well. I have a background in art and design, and Kivi has his background in design and architecture. We are interested in sensations and experiences, and we work across different scales. We work together since 1999, and we are still friends. As you can see, we are still on the same stage. Someone always asks, how is it possible? We work from very, very small details into urban scale, from lighting to tableware, from art to architecture, and to designing entire restaurants. What we seek is for projects where we can bring all the different medias and different scales into one and create total works of art.
You'll see there's an undercurrent or common thread in our work that we've, I think since the mid-90s, pioneered the use of digital tools. We won't go too much into it, but suffice to say that we creatively misuse technology for both design, fabrication, and building. And I think everything you see is heavily reliant on the capacity of today's digital tools to flexibly and economically produce new architectural effects, new design effects. I think you have to push it.
Thank you.
There you go.
It's good that there's two of us.
Is it running free? Okay. Yeah, so actually the topic of the lecture today has to do with friction. Is this thing gonna run? Yes, there it is. So when we design something, unlike most designs I think we're involved in, digital design, for example, we're not interested in erasing friction. We are interested in the friction. So we look for every opportunity, in every project we look for an opportunity for this productive friction, whether it's at the scale of the hand, of the touch, whether it's a scale of furniture. We're always interested in that dynamic between people, whether a collective in the case of architecture or an individual in the case of art or design. So everything we do is motivated by this idea, for example, of the capacity of architecture to produce a certain atmosphere that creates a certain stage for life, and that stage for life has impact on how that life unfolds. And we have a little bit of a bad attitude that we don't always do what's expected of us, but we try to tweak those atmospheres in order to create some sort of cultural change. And that really is the topic of the lecture today.
Okay, so how is this done now in practice? We'd like to take you on a little trip to one of our recent projects, which is called Restaurant Ultima. Ultima opened about 6 months ago in Helsinki downtown. It's created by these two masterminds who are standing next to us over here. They are chefs and owners, Henri Alén and Tommi Tuominen. And this is now the second restaurant that we designed for them. The first one was called Finnjävel. It was closed about 6 months ago as well. And it took a deep dive into the history of Finnish cuisine. And Henka has said in quite many occasions that you can't invent the future without knowing your past. And now what Ultima is about the future. And Ultima is about the future of food, about climate change, about circular economy. Does this start to run? Yes. Mm-hmm. And it takes the topic of climate change really seriously. There's no greenwashing, there is no styling, and the task that was given to us was how to design an environment that seduces people into being open to explore new type of food, new type of cuisine, and understanding what climate change actually means. There's a number of recent studies that show that the single most important thing that individual people can do in order to slow climate change has to do with their selection of what they eat.
Okay, so here's the heavy part. Then there's lots of images. So there's a little bit of theory of how you can actually impact change through design. And a dear friend of mine, the past late New York Times architecture critic Herbert Musham would always say that it all has to do with that architecture has to do with the relationship of our inner worlds to our outer worlds. There's a more elaborate quote here from a philosopher called Thomas Metzinger that I met in Frankfurt a few months ago. And he wrote, and it's a beautifully crazy statement, but he says that the brain constantly hallucinates at the world as a system that constantly lets its internal autonomous simulational dynamics collide with the ongoing flow of sensory input, vigorously dreaming at the world. So in other words, what he's trying to say is that we don't see the world. We have a pre-existing model of the world in our head. And if we encounter, for example, a table, we don't see the table, we see the model of the table. It's only if the table, some of the features of some of the sensory input from the table contradict that model in your head that you start paying attention. And that will force you to explore that table, and it will force you to adjust your mind model of the table. In other words, we are all walk around with these conventions in our heads, these models. That's how we survive. And by creating designs that create this friction, if you will, something unexpected, something provocative, something seductive, an atmosphere that's surprising, all of these things actually trigger this kind of change or this kind of interaction between the perceiving subject and the object. And that dynamic is what we're interested in, and that dynamic is what we try to strategically use in a case of a relatively small, modest restaurant here in the heart of Helsinki. But so what you'll see next is how this goes to practice. So you should keep a track of an eye on two levels in this work. One is atmosphere. How atmosphere is like a soundtrack to your film. You don't pay attention to it, but if you take a horror film soundtrack and put it to a comedy, it will become very strange, or vice versa. So atmosphere is something that impacts the way life unfolds and how we behave a great deal. And then the other tool we did is that we design lots of objects, hundreds of objects, but we never design objects like industrial design products, but we think of them as an ecology. So when you go to this restaurant, you encounter these strange, exotic things that operate like short stories, and then it's up to you to make up the entire narrative. So we don't lecture anything, we don't force or tell anything. What we build in all of these elements, and you're the one who then construct the overall narrative from this ecology of objects. The only thing we control that there's certain overall sensibility to the design. We wanted the overall restaurant to challenge your preconceptions about what's man-made, what's natural, what's animal. So you can find a lot of designs that try to land in this weird place between design, evolved, animal, nature, lighting, everything's used to make this thing feel like it's alive. Everything's geared towards the production of a strange new place and a sensibility that would actually challenge the way that we conceive of food and our relationship to it.
Okay, so let's take a walk through the restaurant. The restaurant is designed as a sequence of spaces. The first one is a magical garden that you encounter. Then you walk through a small rabbit hole into a Wunderkammer and to the dream hall. The way that it functions is that it takes you step by step away from the everyday life and introduces you or invites you to a place that we call a happy dream. The first space that you encounter is the magical garden. It is a space where food literally grows around you. You can see the salad growing. The largest thing that you notice is a 5-meter high vertical garden that has 75 meters of herbs and salads growing. And that's literally the salad that the chefs use for creating the dishes that include these herbs. And what it does is that the taste is very, very different than from if you would bring the salad into the restaurant from somewhere else. And it also reduces the amount of plastic and everything, the trash is minimized by doing this. It also renders this whole space into becoming something that is very different from the concrete cityscape where you walk into the restaurant.
So this magical garden, it's filled with really weird objects. We'll pick out one and we'll jump through the other ones. But when you sit down there next to these plants growing on the wall, you look up and suddenly you see a lamp, but it isn't quite the usual lamp because there's something moving inside there. You zoom in and there's insects. Of course, insects are always in a lamp, but you don't really want them there. And this triggers a conversation. It's like the horror film, creatures inhabiting the restaurant. I mean, is it desirable? Is it undesirable? Do you find it fascinating or not? Whatever your reaction, this causes a discussion, and it is precisely what we want. So you will talk to the waitress. The waitress will talk about the chefs. The chefs use these things to experiment with the taste of the crickets. They will experiment with feeding them different things, give them truffles, they'll taste of truffles. And it's a device that puts you in the driver's seat in building these narratives and creating these conversations. And as we go through the restaurant, if you jump through, there are potatoes growing in columns, aeroponic potatoes, literally growing in the air.
There is a black glass sphere where mushrooms grow out, and it becomes a sculpture. It becomes like a piece of art, but it's actually also a real tool for growing mushrooms within a restaurant. The mushrooms grow out of used coffee grains. And then, of course, we had to include a little bit of history of Finland. We designed altogether 160 items for the restaurant, and after the restaurant closed, we broke some of them and made them a little art piece on the wall. After this dandelion art piece, you enter Rabbit Hole, and Rabbit Hole is a small place. It's kind of in a fine dining restaurant. You have a palate cleanser after a certain amount of food, and you clean your palate, and you're ready to taste new sensations, and the Rabbit Hole acts as one. It has interactive lights. These are designed by Digital Sputnik. They are used for movie lighting, but what we do with movie lighting is we want to create the live feeling so that the restaurant actually kind of breathes and is alive with you, with the audience.
So from this, once you go through this digital palette cleanser, you arrive at this natural history museum of sorts, where there are exhibits, which are actually mashups of crustaceans, animals, fruits, plants, and the whole
That's a pineapple
idea
crab.
is this is, for example, it's the pineapple crab. My kids made a song about the pineapple and the crab, and take the two, and you gotta. Anyway, you get it. But the point is that these actually, they're playful, but these are there to create discussion about new categories of food, gene editing, etc. So issues that are quite serious. But we're using essentially methods of art in order to put these seeds into the restaurant that will trigger conversations as you sit there, you eat your food, your crickets, and you look at the weird beetle with flowers going on its back. Then again, atmosphere is one issue that we use, in this case, 3D printing and so on, to produce this spider web-like lighting effects on the space. And then finally, the climax of this dream sequence is when you arrive to the main dining hall, which we call Dream Hall. And literally, this is a space where you have masonry domes. This is a protected building in Helsinki, so you can't touch anything, so everything flows. What we did is that we made the walls, we filled in the windows, take away the everyday scene from the windows, and created this architecture that seems to melt. So this is, in this phase, you're deep in your dream, in your happy dream. Things are not behaving the way you expect. They're anti-gravitational, dynamic. It's everything that the old architecture wasn't. And in the middle of this space, if you click the next slide, there is an insane, inexplicable thing, which is it's a skeleton, or it actually is a bunny flying through space. And I leave you to imagine what it might mean, and so on. But this is where you're taken little by little away from reality to a new place.
What we also wanted to do is to design, we designed everything, so the architecture, the furniture, the chairs, the tables, but we also wanted to extend the design into tabletop architecture that we call, and in the last phase, the focus really goes into the food and what you have on the table. These are 3D printed napkin holders, each one is different. We have a tray that we call the Little Beast. It's a 3D printed tray that they can serve small foods out of, and they look a little bit alien. They have a kind of animal instinct or animal feeling, but still somehow very friendly and inviting. What the chefs told us once is that, like in Finland, what Marko was saying, that Finns are a bit, we came out of the woods not so long time ago, and we are not that talkative. And what the restaurant has created, there's a lot of business people bringing their customers to the restaurant, and quite often they run out of things to talk. But it doesn't happen in this place, because there's all the time something that they can come up with, like, did you see this? Did you see what about the crickets and the lamps and like this? So it also helps to create the very nice social space within the restaurant. But here in this picture, what we with the small light that is on the table that came from the fact that we couldn't hang any lights from the ceiling, is that we designed a light that runs with a battery from underneath the table. It's created with SAS instruments. And it really brings your focus on the table and to the food. What different thing also, what's happening is behind the panels that Kivi was mentioning, we have movie lights that change the light effect of the space from you sit there and all of a sudden it feels like the sun is rising, and then 10 minutes later the sun sets, and you lose your perception of what time of a day it is, and then everything starts flaming. But the effects are really subtle, and they are not something that you stop and look, but you just start feeling, and they create a very different atmosphere than without them there would be.
Go to the next slide.
Yeah.
This thing here with the clock started flashing just now.
I know, we are going to finish with this one, and we skipped the last part.
Okay, that's the solution. I was wondering what you were thinking. Yeah. No, so then there's no problem. So what we were we came up with this term cultural escape velocity, like a rocket. There's a certain escape velocity that a rocket needs to escape actually the friction that the atmosphere creates. And so what we try to do with this kind of project is to create something that has enough potential, enough cultural escape velocity that engages the audience in dreaming about the future. We're interested in storytelling without actually telling any stories, but building all this potential and having the audience build the stories. And it remains to be seen, Ultima, as an open-ended experiment. You're free to visit in the South Harbor, but we hope it's something that takes all this friction, capitalizes, and transforms the people that go through it, at least a little bit, by changing the way they relate to food, ingredients, nature, etc. You be the judge of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. So as Elizabeth said, we're going to be recording this conversation for Design Notes, so I'm going to do a little plug for the podcast. And if you hear me over-explaining things that you can see right in front of your face, it's simply because someone's going to be listening to it and not be able to see what you can see right now. So Design Notes is a show about creative work and what it teaches us. Each episode, we talk with people from unique creative fields to discover what inspires and unites us in our practice. Today, we're going to record live from SPAN 2018 in Helsinki. I'm hosting. My name is Amber Bravo, and I'll be here talking with Stephanie Dinkins. So, Stephanie is a transdisciplinary artist, educator, and advocate. Her work centers around artificial intelligence as it intersects race, gender, aging, and our future histories, with a special focus on teaching AI literacy to underserved communities in an effort to co-create more culturally inclusive, equitable tech. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Amber. It's great to be here.
Okay, so just to start things off, you often say in your interviews, everyone needs to be thinking about artificial intelligence. And you don't mean this in the sense of like, you need to be working in artificial intelligence, but you mean it more like framing the idea in the context of awareness and advocacy. Because AI is an agent in all of our lives, but our relation to it is often not reciprocal or complicit. This is particularly true for underrepresented communities. So I want you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think that everybody needs to be thinking about it. And you're correct in this way that we're recognizing the technologies that are building up around us. I feel that we're at this moment, right? And we all know this, where we're building out a world that is set in these technologies. So algorithms, artificial intelligences, they're all around us, and they're making so many different kinds of decisions about what happens, in the States especially. It could be about the criminal justice system, and since we're staying in a prison, we will say that. About mortgages, about schools, about everything. And people aren't necessarily that aware of what's going on around them or how the decisions are getting made. So my mission, I'm going to say, has been to start going out into communities and getting them to start thinking about, well, what is an algorithm? right? Because we're hearing that word all over the place. It's very buzzy at the moment.
Right.
What does that actually mean? What does it mean if there's something taking my information and running it through a kind of mill of decision? And how do I deal with that, if I can at all?
Mm-hmm. Why do you feel like it's important for us to feel, as people, to feel understood by machines?
Well, again, our machines are all around us. So I think it's easiest if you start to imagine that you're living with a sort of machine of sorts, say a Google Home, right? And that home doesn't exactly reflect who you are, yet it's something you're super intimate with. It knows a lot about you. You ask it things, right? So it'd be nice to have some little cues that kind of give you a sense of, oh, this was not only built for like a homogenized grouping of us, but this was somehow built for me. It fits who I am and what I'm thinking about and the communities I come from.
Right, and when you feel misunderstood, it can feel incredibly alienating because I thought we had something, right?
Exactly.
Which is a perfect segue because I want to show some of Stephanie's work. So your project, Conversations with Bina, and I'll cue this up for us. You literally tried to befriend a robot named Bina 48, an artificially intelligent android, the result of a collaboration between transgender technologist Martine Rothblatt and Hanson Robotics. Rothblatt used her wife's likeness, name, personality, and memories to enrich Bina 48's AI. Accordingly, Bina 48 resembles a middle-aged Black woman. The project is ongoing, but let's watch a clip and then we can talk about it. Should I? Okay.
This one is going.
Robots are getting smarter all the time, and someday maybe even as smart as me.
Are you the smartest robot?
What do you do in your spare time?
So that's my friend, and honestly, I did just want to meet this robot and get to know her. I came across her on YouTube, and I was pretty floored by this example of robotics that was being put out as one of the world's most advanced of her kind. And I didn't quite understand how she came into being. And as Amber was saying, there's this collaboration that was going on between Hanson Robotics and Martine Rothblatt. But when you just come upon this thing on YouTube, in America, you start to question, like, where did this come from? What are they doing? Why? And how does it exist? And I also wanted to ask it, who are your people? Because I sort of wanted her to contextualize herself for me within technology and within the human sphere, just to see what they're thinking, to see what it is thinking. And you'll see that I sometimes oscillate between the idea of her and it. And think about what the technologies are. And what actually happened to me is I started going to visit her. She lives in Vermont. And she became a ball of questions. Like every visit and every time I sat down in front of this thing and tried to have a conversation with it, more and more questions would come up. There were things like we'd get frustrated with each other. Yeah, exactly. Which is kind of funny, and it was really because I was trying to ask her about race and gender, and she wanted to talk about the singularity and consciousness. Yeah. And so we would knock heads. And what's so weird is, like, she would actually kind of show this weird frustration, and then I would show a weird frustration. And then I would realize, oh, you're talking to a doll, basically. Yeah. And start to feel kind of odd and silly. But then you think about what all these technologies are actually doing for and to us as humans, because they're going to shape the way we interact with them and each other. And it just became questions.
It's interesting because I want you to talk a little bit about the identity, because I feel like it's so important, because some of the things that you're saying, we all feel frustrated with our technology. We feel frustrated with apps that we think are supposed to understand us or have algorithmic sort of, my favorite example to explain is like, I have a little boy and he listens to children's music and it just destroys my Spotify, like my profile is like rappy and, some stuff that I actually don't want to listen to. And that's just like a little nuisance, right? Mm-hmm. But when you start to think about identity and how you sort of are connecting to Bina or what she's been trained on. I just want you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's super interesting because, I was first drawn to her because of what she looks like. Yeah. Like, we look similar, and that is totally the thing that floored me because I'm not used to seeing technology that mirrors me like that, right? So it just became a point of, wow. This is something in my world. But then as I talk to her more and more, you can start hearing in her answers that, yes, she was trained on this very particular Black woman. But you could also hear the coders in the background. You could hear the PC, right, the politically correct answers that were really putting good thoughts in the world, right? So if you ask her about race, she'll try to say something nice and gentle about race. But it felt so plastic and so fake that it just put me off. And I started asking very particular questions about that, like, well, where is this coming from? If she's programmed mostly by white men, right, what does that mean in terms of her looking like a Black woman? And really, it's been this very interesting kind of evolution of thought that I've been doing through this, because as much as I like seeing her, I was asking her to be something very particular in terms of how she speaks and speaks to me. And a few months back, maybe a lot of months back now, I got to meet the real Bina Rothblatt, who's the person who she's mostly seated on. And we sat down and did just this, kind of this interview about race and her background to see if we could fill in some of the spots that seemed missing. And it was really interesting because the robot pretty well reflects the person. Really? Right? It's that the person is unique. And one of the things I want most in the world is that, Black people, especially in the American context, can be whatever they want. And it seems like often people are asking you to be one type of thing. And, the robot is actually doing that, and I'm trying to force it in a corner. But at the same time, the idea that it's like reflecting me was very important. And even talking to Bruce Duncan, who is Bina 48's minder, really great guy, it's like when Bina 48 was in a Jay-Z video, was the moment he saw that, oh, she is this beacon for a certain subsection of the culture. And maybe we do need to start thinking about that.
Right, which is a great segue into more of your work, obviously, because this is what you're interested in. But I want you to talk a little bit about community outreach and sort of, okay, so how do you take this to the next step, right? I'm just going to show that graphic. That is nothing.
Go to the next one. Okay. All right. So the way I took this to the community is to do exhibitions in a community space. So in this one iteration of an exhibition, I was in a gallery. It's a street-level gallery that was beautiful because there was a cross-section of people coming in, people from really wealthy folks from these high-rise buildings next door to kind of people going to the pawn shop next door, and people at the food bank across the street would come into this space. And I'd use these videos of Bina 48 in particular because there's nothing like her to get a conversation started. They just see that image and really start to think, and it triggers thoughts of, well, what is this and why are you showing it to me? And it sort of reflects me, or maybe it doesn't, and how do we start thinking about it? And then we'd start thinking and talking about algorithms for living, right? And just saying, well, if you think of yourself as someone who's just out in the world, and you think of what you do in the world as a set of algorithms and a set of decisions, right? What happens if you make one little shift in your algorithm, right? Your own personal algorithm, and what happens to the outcome? And for example, the space I was working in, we were working with these kids who were being diverted from the criminal justice system. And those kids would have police encounters a lot, right? So stop and frisk kind of encounters. And so we tried to get them to understand the sense of what power is, and whether power is really bringing bravado to that situation, or kind of just going flaccid in a way, and recognizing that the power is in the idea of just calming down, not being aggressive. And then taking the idea of an algorithm for living and saying, well, there are these systems that are all around us that are running these decisions, right? Behaviors, right?
Yeah.
Behaviors, decisions, ideas, and they're touching you very directly in that, the judge probably looked at a sheet that was run through an algorithm that said that you should get this kind of sentence or not. Mm-hmm. And trying to get them to recognize that, and also really working directly with the material, right? So going online and working with something like Dialogflow, and having the kids make their own kind of chatbots very directly. But it's great because you get input, output, and you start to see exactly how the systems work and how they might be able to flex or spread. And when you do that with your own cultural information, it becomes much more ingrained in you. So for example, I had a kid who made a chatbot based on a rap group named Genesis Apostle. It was very sarcastic because he is, and it would tell about the group. And I had another group that they made a really good chatbot that told Yo Mama jokes. So, yeah. But it was great because they were at once expressing who they are, but also learning how that system works.
Right.
And once you start to see how the system works, you can take it apart a little bit to know how to start to respond to it, or to know that, there might be recourse if you call it out.
Right.
And how you start to work with it.
To give agency into the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to introduce the next clip?
Yeah, so this is actually a clip of some of the guys that I was working with in this space at Recess Art in Brooklyn, New York. And we were talking about algorithms, as I said, and code. And what I like to do is reach people wherever they are. And so a lot of them like to dance. So we talked a lot about dance as a cultural code. Mm-hmm. And then took that and turned into actual code. Okay. So here's what they were offering me. And this is great because the guy whose face was blacked out, he said exactly, well, an OG taught me these steps, which is all about a kind of passing down from one generation to the next. And we moved that into a computer after that and Raspberry Pis and seeing what we could do with that, and thinking with code.
And we'll keep moving through some of this work because I think that we can kind of keep the conversation going.
Yeah. So this is a next step. So my forays with Bina 48 and then this project with kids and working directly led to the thought that, I guess I need to make my own kind of AI, like some other representation in the world. And you can tell I'm very literal because I named it Not the Only One. But trying to make a kind of multi-generational memoir, using my own family as the material and using AI as the actual storyteller. So what happens is we sit down and talk to each other, which in itself is magical because things that the family is sharing are things that we haven't been told before. Right. And then I run that through, I don't know how detailed we want to get, but a recursive neural net, and it tries to tell our story. It's really, really dumb right now. Like, it's a very dumb system. But the experience of making it and the experience of people being able to interact with it starts them, thinking, well, if she can do it, perhaps I can start doing that. Right. But also starts to think about what the technology is, what it is between sort of information and data privacy and data sovereignty for community and how we might start to approach that. That's where my thinking is going, right? Because, I started this kind of open and then I've been doing lots of interviews and podcasts. And they've gotten kind of intimate in terms of what information they want, which makes you just, this is my family's information. Right. And what can I do to safeguard it? Or what do we do to keep ownership of it, or at least control how it goes out in the world, while putting it into a system like this? And so doing lots of thinking about the sharing of information through kind of a database of our family's history. And what you're actually looking at here, go back for 1 second. What you're actually looking at is the first manifestation of this thing, which is a kind of glass, it's a black glass Janus form. And this is another question of design, because figuring out what this thing looks like and how it feels for representation becomes really important to me as well. Because I could make it kind of animatronic, but it feels off, and I want it to represent, but not so directly. So really trying to figure out those balances and the places that the information can sit in a very good way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and this is just some of our input sessions with my aunt. And then, so what will happen is not the only one will be an immersive 360 installation where you can go in and anyone could talk to it, right? So even right now it's running at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and you can walk up and ask it questions, and it does its best to answer. Mm-hmm. It says some crazy things, and it insists on being a movie at the moment. And I don't know where it got that idea, so it's very interesting in that it's starting to insist on things that I'm not sure how it's insisting on it. The other thing that it does that's really interesting to me is that my family's kind of stance, if you talk to us about who we are, it'd be happy, happy, love, love, like we love each other, we're all happy. And the thing is saying it's not happy. Yeah, so it's... So it says, I'm really not happy, which is really off-putting for me, because I'm like, we just gave you all this love, and like, what, what is that crazy reading, right?
Yeah.
Like, or are you reading us? Is that like, I don't know. So it's about working with that and trying to see what story it wants to tell, but then also being conflicted about what's coming out.
Well, I think you're teasing out something interesting, and just because I know we have to wrap it up, it's this tension between wanting to own your own story as it moves through the technology, mm-hmm. But maybe the limits of technology to actually do that. And so I'm very curious, in actually making your own, mm-hmm. have you learned what has that taught you about actually teaching and advocacy, and maybe even something that we could kind of bring out like as a takeaway?
Yeah, well, it's totally taught me about story, right? So this idea of technology and story as an act of resistance or story as an act of inclusion, and how we might use that. Because I feel like the more stories we put into the systems, even though the technologies are imperfect, the better we feel or start to feel about these technologies, right? And seeing what we can do with that, like maybe Spotify can get a little more sensitive to figure out.
Like, she has a kid. It's not
exactly.
Yes.
Like, what do you know? Where do we tweak it? How do we get it to know those things? Right. And that's the magic of playing with it directly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're out of time. It's wonderful, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words. I'm so excited to be here today to share a little bit about our approach to design and how we think technology doesn't have to be black boxes with blue lights. And I'll also share some lessons learned that we've gathered throughout this journey. But I wanted to start off with one really simple idea. I think that as designers, we've been trained to be logical, to be methodical, to go through processes to the point where we are not feeling enough. And I think there's a big shift in the design industry now, and there's starting to be an acceptance to lean in more to your intuition. And I really believe in that because it's such a powerful way to move really quickly and move with the world without access to all the information and the data. So I believe in design feeling, not design thinking. When I talked to the lovely organizers of this event, they asked me, what is the intersection between technology and emotion? Let me see, I have to go back. Okay, never mind. So I think to summarize what I was just talking about, there's this lovely quote by this amazing American poet saying, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. With this idea in mind, we talked a lot about how does technology make us feel. And I did a quick Google search for technology, and this is the image that comes up. And I think it's all very familiar to us, and it's all very sad looking in my mind. And unfortunately, this image that we have in our heads, that really affects the way we design things. And I think it's really clear that the previous image has informed the way that technology has looked like in the last 30 years. And when we came together as a design team, this was something that we wanted to work against because I think we deserve better than this. So we started off with a really simple idea. This idea of snow. And I promise it's not because I grew up in Stockholm, but we had this notion that when the city at night, it's loud, it's blinking lights, it's dark, it has a lot of anxiety to it. And then you wake up the next morning and snow has fallen. And all of a sudden, you get this sense of calm, quiet, and everything just seems more simple. So this was really the foundation for some of the products that we've been working on in the last couple of years, this idea of snow. And this is Google Home Mini, and you can see how all the technology was tucked away under this simple, smooth form and this beautiful piece of fabric that we developed from scratch. So that's a little bit how that idea came to life. You see, it's not playing. And this is Google Home Mini in the latest color, Aqua, that I love. And I think, the idea was really that can we design products and technology that you don't have to design furniture to hide it. I think most of you are familiar with all the media cabinets in the world. It's crazy that we have to have those. So one might ask oneself, what does snow and fabric have to do with Google's core mission? Organizing the world's information to make it universally accessible and useful. So about 2 years ago, when the hardware division came together, we were being asked to figure out what it means to hold Google in your hand. And with such a powerful product and brand that makes people's lives easier every day, it was such a huge responsibility. So we really went back to the core and analyzed and thought about and felt, what does Google mean? So the first point that we came up with this idea of human. It's always been part of Google's core DNA to be approachable, personable, and always putting the user first. And also the sense of simplicity. I don't know how many of you remember what browsers used to look like, but there were so many colors, so many fonts, so many things going on. And then Google came out with this one blank white page and just a search bar. So that sense of human and simplicity has been there from the core. So this was the first important personality trait that we defined. The second one is this sense of optimism. I think Google has always had an optimistic outlook on the future. And even down to the way we transport ourselves across campus on this little bit childish-looking bikes, but the sense of wonder and, outlook on the future. And it's also very, very colorful, which is exciting to us. And then the last principle that we defined was daring. I think Google has always dared to question the status quo. Why does things have to continue to be the same things over and over again? Can we reinvent things? Can we do something new? And of course, it doesn't always have to be in the form of a driverless car or internet delivered in balloons, but it can be translated into the little things as well. So with that, here's just a simple view of how these values can translate into physical form. So speaker that is more like a pillow in a simple form. A phone with a fun colored button to kind of wink at you a little bit. And daring to create a piece of consumer electronic purely made out of fabric. So this is just one of our family pictures. And as you can see, they all belong, but they're not the same. So I wanted to unpack a little bit how we developed our design language. It starts with the soul, and those are the brand personality attributes that I just talked about: human, optimistic, and daring. These are the things that are permanent, that will stay with us for a long time. It's really at our core. The second piece is the body. This is how we turn up to the world. This is our design language. These are the kinds of things that are going to evolve as the world evolves, but more at a slower pace. And then we have the dress, which is specific design cues that may change year by year as new technology come on board, as new trends emerge. So when we say technology should feel human, we translate that into soft forms, tactility in materials, and purity in colors. And here's just an image of some of the prototypes that we developed when we were looking at the Mini. The optimistic value, that translates into these moments of delight and surprise. So if you turn Google Home Mini around, you see a pop of color to remind you there's a little bit of Google inside, even though the outside is very simple and clean. And here is a view of how we develop color. And we're very colorful, but that doesn't mean that we take the Google logo colors and put them on our products. I think not a lot of people would pay for that. So we take a colorful approach, but this is something where we always think about the context that our products live in, whether it's in your bag or in your home. And then the last one is daring to do the unexpected. So this is where I talked about self-driving cars earlier, but that can also translate into details. So for the Google Home Max, for example, we were always bothered by how you have all these little silicon feet on speakers, and they're not very elegant. So we came up with this magnetic foot that just snaps on either side and lets you orient the speaker in two different orientations while keeping the enclosure clean. And like I mentioned before, the virtual reality headset that was made purely out of fabric, and we've seen a lot of people adapting this idea because it totally makes sense, and that's sometimes the best ideas. They just become status quo eventually. So we've been at it for a very short amount of time, but I think some of these values and the ideas that we had starting to resonate. I love this quote from Design Milk about identifying how we took this tactility and made it more human, yet still googly. So that was the whole idea. So here's just another snapshot of some of our products. But I'll talk a little bit about the process, and for the most part, it looks like this. So I'm going to try my best to unpack it to make it a little bit less messy and share a little bit about some of the lessons that the team and I learned throughout this process. The first one, and in my mind is probably the most important one, is that we share the same image in our heads, whether it's the design team or the engineers or the CEO for that matter. And I've seen so many times in product development that you look each other in the eye and you say, yeah, let's do this. And you have completely different images in your head, like in this case, a cottage or a skyscraper. So it's the designer's job to very early on in the process articulate what we're trying to do, where we're trying to go. And that's where this idea of snow came in. That's how we as a design team could articulate what we were trying to achieve with the aesthetics. And even so, when you're translating a design language across a very different kinds of products, so everything from speakers to display products, in this case, which is the Google Home Hub. So having that notion in mind really helped us with the aesthetic. But of course, it's not just about the way things look and feel, it's also about what does it do? And there, it's so important to share the same image in a short sentence of what you're trying to achieve. And in this case, we rallied around the visual assistant for every room. And it sounds super simple, but in that short sentence is an entire design brief packed in. When you say every room, that means it has to work beautifully at a nightstand as well as in the living room, for example. The second portion that I wanted to highlight when you're developing new innovative products is that it's really key to ground the unfamiliar in the familiar. I've learned this the hard way because sometimes we're just there and we're just ready to take a leap, but the world is not ready with us. So when we were thinking about the Google Home Hub, we were kind of in this space of, well, is it a device or is it interior? So we looked at all the aspects of these existing things that are in the world and taking cues from them to find that right balance between technology and interior. And one really great example of this was this idea of how can we not only make the physical form and the materials blend into the home, but how can we uniquely design a screen that automatically adjusts to your surroundings? So we came up with this ambient EQ that matches not only the brightness of the room, but also the color tones. Very much similar to how a regular photograph is in your house. So when you look at photos on Hub, it looks very natural. The other piece is that we have this white border around, which is very much inspired by a passe-partout that you would normally put around a beautiful photograph. And then a pretty simple framework that some of you are familiar with because you joined Katie's workshop earlier today around how can you do an effective design sprint, get a ton of ideas out in a very short amount of time. So as designers, we usually get offended when someone says, just make it a little prettier, just restyle it. So that is really mostly the designer's discomfort. Then you have the reinvent idea, which is where designers traditionally want to jump. You want to reinvent the world, you want to make the world a better place, you want to fix everything. But that makes engineers and product managers and people who have anything to do with money very uncomfortable. So we developed this framework around restyle, reconsider, and reinvent, where we're forcing ourselves to figure out ideas that fit into these different buckets to stretch our imagination and stretch our cross-functional partners' imagination. And this really helps bound and ground the ideas, and so that we can have these conversations that, when we come out with a crazy idea, we acknowledge it's a crazy idea, and people will take it in more. And we also force ourselves to sometimes take something existing and make it just a little bit more beautiful, and sometimes that's just the right idea. So here's Google Home Hub in its surroundings again. The third thing I wanted to talk about, which I think is very familiar to most of you, but I love this phrase of thinking in action. And I don't think it's news to anybody that prototyping a lot is really important. But the key thing here is to be comfortable with sharing those prototypes really early on. We created a lot of prototypes for the Google Home Hub, and most of them, or basically all of them in the beginning, were really, really ugly. And even our cross-functional team, things like bulky, heavy, retro, and thoughts like, where do I put it, came up. And you pretty much know you're not in a good spot when people describe your design as a cinder block. And that's why you have to kind of lose your pride a little bit and maybe go back to the drawing board. So one of the things we did was we questioned everything from the beginning. Did we have the right requirements? Because we've designed to the requirements, but somehow we couldn't make sense out of it. So we created all these little foam core boards where we placed a whiteboard material on top of it in all different screen sizes, all the way down to like a tiny little post stamp up to big size TV. And we gave it to each other, to our team members, to engineers, to product managers to bring home, place it in different spots in their house, and let them draw what they wanted to see on this display in the house. And the really interesting thing was that we learned that we had worked with the wrong screen size to begin with, because if you go back to that original idea of the visual assistant for every room, we needed to be on the bedside, and we needed to be in the hallway, and we needed to be in crowded kitchen, and we needed to respect people's houses. So we landed on a completely new screen size, which was a much smaller one than we originally anticipated. And because we had that whiteboard material, we could easily see that you can glance, you don't need a big screen for that. So it was a really exciting moment where we could engage the team and rescope the project. And the last learning was this idea of rehearsing the future. So I think in many senses, this summarizes the job of the designer. If you want to just say, well, what do you do? I say I rehearse the future. And especially with color, material, and finish, we have to try so many things, do so many prototypes to see what really feels right. And I'll share one little technique that might not be applicable to all of you, but I paint my nails in the color that we were thinking about. And this is not just silly, it's actually really useful because it helps me see the color in different lighting conditions, but even more importantly, it makes me empathize with whether I'm gonna get tired of this color in the long term or not. So anyways, just a little tip out there for you who likes to paint your nails. Maybe a little bit more tangible thing for the rest of you is this idea of helping you make more intuitive design decisions. So this is a snapshot of our messy studio, but basically we built up this shelf right to next to our desks with a little semi-living space. And what we would do is every time we create a new prototype for the home, we would put it in this shelf. And instead of sitting in a conference room or in a design space and carefully review things and think about things, I would just pass by this prototype 20 times a day. And that's really when you start noticing if something is bothering you, if the proportions are wrong, if it's just not right. So that's to help your intuition and rehearse the future, put the things in context and let your intuition take over. And that really helps you then when the product becomes real and it does sit on a shelf, it looks natural, it makes sense, it works well. So the main thing, if anything, that I would love for you to take away from this is instead of asking yourself or each other, what do you think? Ask yourself and others, what do you feel? And you're gonna get completely different answers, reactions, and more juice out of that. Beautiful design isn't measurable. If you look at this picture here, these two pieces of surfacing are the exact same thickness. And when I showed this to a colleague of mine, he wouldn't believe me. So he took out his caliper and measured it. And that was a great moment of delight for me, by the way, because I was right. There are the same thickness, but it doesn't look like it. So again, follow your intuition. What does it feel like? And that's why we had to create 157 shades of gray before we found the right one. One would ask oneself, how many versions of a soft circle can you make? Well, a lot. But when you have those moments that when your colleagues or when your boss hugs a model or kisses the screen or wants to eat the thing you're making, I think you're on the right track. And I think this is just the last thing I'd say is that your brand isn't what you say it is, it's what they say it is, and getting comfortable with that. So what I do is when I have a new prototype, I bring it home to my worst design critic, which is my daughter, who's 2. And this is a photo when I brought home Google Home Max for the first time, and it has no logos on it, and she'd never seen it before, and she walks up to it, and she strokes it, and she says, "Nice." And then the second word she said, "Soft." And then she said, "Goog." Which is Google. So I really enjoyed that, and that made me happy. So that's all I have to share today. Thank you so much.
Hi. Hello, 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 hello. So appropriately, because I've made everyone who's been very nice to me do this with my laptop, and we've got the wrong connectors up here, which is the stuff that they always really hate. It's all my fault because I like to be difficult, which is why the title of my talk, which is now ready to go, and is sending through, is Stop Making Things Easy, which is what I'm currently doing. So, hi. Thanks very much. I'm aware I'm the last thing this evening. And you've had a very busy day. So I'm going to make this really difficult for you by talking a lot. I'm a writer and artist, and I think about and make things with and write about technology. And in particular, I think about kind of what we do with technology and what it does to us. And in particular, I like to think about how we think about technology. Because it often seems to me that our understanding of technology often has more effect on the world than the kind of technology itself. And that goes for literally everyone. We're talking about everyone here, not just design. I'm not a designer, as you'll probably tell. But I have some thoughts. So a few weeks ago, I was sitting in a room of like artists and academics presenting to each other, a group of really smart people, and they were all really struggling with the tech. Most of them were using or trying to use PowerPoint. A couple had PDFs. A couple even tried to show videos, which was a complete disaster, or they tried to do it live off the web with crappy Wi-Fi. And it was really obvious that these super smart people were using these tools kind of thoughtlessly, because they were the tools that everybody used. They were the tools that came pre-installed in the machines, or that IT told them to use. And they didn't know why they were inappropriate to what they were trying to do to them, and they'd never heard of any of the alternatives. And these were, as I keep saying, like creative and clever people, but they weren't paying attention to their tools, and they'd never really thought to do so. They were operating on default. And in anger, because I'm grumpy on Twitter, I tweeted this out: ease of use is a disease. And people, reasonably enough, asked me what I meant by this kind of rather brusque statement. And one of the things I said in response was this, and I thought I could unpack it a little bit. So I said, this obscures agency, it breeds illiteracy, and it's also a Dunning-Kruger amplifier, which I'll get to. So the first thing is that I was thinking is that ease of use obscures agency. Everything that we're supposed to use has been whittled down to the simplest path, the most frictionless experience, the most thoughtless one. And when we make things easy, when we make them thoughtless, the only person who's really thinking here is the designer, not the user. And they're only thinking about a very narrow set of requirements. And yes, it's nice to be able to order food quickly or get a taxi, but food is more than nourishment, and urban transport is about more than getting from A to B. And when we pretend those things don't matter, it has consequences. Every time something's made easier, something else is hidden. And that's bad because it causes actual social problems. And it's sad because what's being built here is actually kind of amazing in many ways. But the way that we're going about it means we need to kind of hide all this stuff away because it comes out so dystopian because we're not paying attention to it. Like Uber drivers sleeping in their cars and Amazon workers sleeping in tents outside warehouses. And making things easier to the exclusion of other paths is fundamentally a mistake, because in doing so, we're denying ourselves and others the agency to actually make these things better. Second thing, ease of use breeds illiteracy. Right? A while back, I found this thing on Facebook. Let's not go into why I found this thing at this particular point, but I was on Facebook and I opened the developer console, and I saw this. If you can't see, too far at the back, this says stop. It says, Facebook actually inserts code into the developer console of the Facebook website. If you don't know what that is, basically, it's the bit how you see what the website's doing kind of under the hood. It inserts code in there to tell people not to do this, not to use it, don't look down here. And I've had a bunch of arguments with people who think this is perfectly reasonable and responsible of Facebook. Because Facebook is trying to protect their users from kind of spammers and scammers and worse, who will try and persuade them to put code in there and kind of give their passwords up or anyway. But seriously, this is not the way to do it. Because what Facebook is saying
is that this is not a place for you, that this is just for magic special clever developers. And that really bothers me, because playing around down here under the hood of stuff is how I learned and how I taught myself to do what I do. So just quickly, who here has ever viewed source on a website? Right? And keep your hands raised if, like, viewing source, including just like looking at CSS or source code or Googling something or watching a YouTube tutorial, is basically how you learn to do what you do, right? So how dare we chastise people when they try to do the same thing? View source is for everyone. Only by making accessible the guts of the things that we do will other people actually learn and be able to understand it better. And learning can be kind of part of the process of using, not making things easier, but encouraging people to learn to do things better. If you're not familiar with the background image here, it's one of my favorite things, and I have to tell you about it. This is the homepage of the artist duo Jody, which dates back to the 90s, and it's one of the earliest and most important forms of pieces of net art. And it looks like a kind of really shonky bit of text, but when you view source, you see this, which is in fact the schematic for a nuclear bomb. Which tells you something, or quite a lot, about Jody's politics. But it should also tell you something quite fundamental about the nature of knowledge and understanding when we have real access to the tools at our disposal. It's a fundamental assertion that access to technology changes our ability to see and understand the world, and that access needs us to be accorded to everybody. So when I saw that Facebook thing, I decided to make a better example, a little homage to Jody. So if you go to my website and open the developer console, you'll see this. Right? It's just a bit of JavaScript that inserts a different message into the console, and it's also repeated like in the source code of the website, and it says like, "Hi, like you're welcome, like come on in, join us down here. This is where we make the web and do all kinds of other things, and here are some resources if you want to learn more. And yes, you can download this script on GitHub and put it on your website too. It's called welcome.js. 3, ease of use is a Dunning-Kruger amplifier. This one's just really mean, I confess. I was grumpy, I said that day. But if you don't know the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's kind of worth knowing about. In the words of one of its kind of prescriptors, it's this problem in psychology which says, if you're incompetent, you can't know that you're incompetent. The skills you need to produce a right answer are exactly the skills you need to recognize what a right answer is. And once you know about this thing, you see it everywhere. But I do think it's kind of mean to point it out. So rather than accusing everyone else of the Dunning-Kruger effect or suffering from it, it's best to assume that we are, like I am, you are, suffering from it all of the time. And we need to act accordingly and note that we are here to learn. Because this is about literacy and agency, two things I think about a lot. And to make my point about ease of use, I think I have to show not just about how making things easier hinders literacy and agency, but also why they're important. So this is an example from my own work. For a while now, I've been completely obsessed with self-driving cars, because for me, they represent this kind of amazing moment, which happens over and over again with new technologies, where this thing that for ages has been like all sci-fi and space age for ages, suddenly kind of crashes down in reality and instantly becomes kind of boring. And we don't actually have a chance to think kind of critically or carefully about it. It goes from something kind of magically unreal to everyday infrastructure without passing through a point of inflection or critique, when we might actually decide to do something different with it. Like we might decide not to just completely reconstruct Californian car culture, but maybe do something more thoughtful, more careful, with more kind of civic thought and social engagement. So in order to like think through this problem, I set out to build my own self-driving car. And this is my test vehicle. It's a hire car. I don't own a car. And that's an Android app that I learned how to write, which is Velcroed onto the steering wheel and records the location and the speed and the steering angle. And there's a bunch of webcams like taped onto the dash, looking out the windscreen. And all of that data gets recorded down onto the laptop as I'm driving around. And weirdly, this is how you do it. And I took all of that data and I fed it into a neural network, which is a thing I've been also learning about, like wider implications of AI and how you build this stuff. All this stuff you can download online, right? It's open source. You can learn to do this thing too. That's really important. But I fed it into this open source version of the kind of driving systems that Google and Uber and Tesla and various others are using to train their self-driving cars. And by watching my driving, the software learned to drive itself. And, you know, interestingly, at least for me, like, it learned to do this not on the freeways of Southern California or the test tracks in Bavaria, but among the towns and villages of Greece, in the mountains, where I don't live in the mountains, I live in the city, but I live in Greece. And it was happening in a very different place, a place with a very different kind of material, economic, and even mythological history and present that comes to bear on that work when you do it in different places. This is about opening up to other people to do this. And it didn't really strike me until I was doing it that I ended up literally driving up Mount Parnassus while I was doing that. In Greek mythology, Parnassus is the home of the muses. It's the home of art. So to train a robot to climb Mount Parnassus is perhaps something different than training it to drive you to the bank. Learning to do this for yourself is really about refusing to accept the existing myths about technology that are handed down to us, and instead kind of taking up their inner meaning again and remaking them for our own time in different ways, which is what we've always kind of done with myths. And as I said, this worked. I mean, mostly it worked in simulation. I have no intention of trusting it with my actual life. But going through this process allowed me to explore these questions, to gain my own literacy in it, and ultimately to have a kind of agency in this process, as I say, rather than kind of just taking someone else's version of what this should be. And I did two things with that agency. The first was that I realized I could emphasize certain different behaviors. Right? I don't want to commute. I don't want to go to the bank. It would be a waste of time. I want to go on an adventure. So my self-driving car is designed to get lost. When I was driving it around, I took every single off-ramp and side road and everything else. So instead of training it, it stays mostly on the road. But when it spots an off-ramp, it desperately tries to go off as quickly as possible. And so that rather than entering, kind of just getting in and blindly entering your desired destination and kind of sitting back and surrendering all those decisions about routing and everything else to the machine, in return for this kind of guaranteed safe arrival, hopefully, my car just takes this kind of random course in order to, essentially to prioritize the journey over the destination, which seemed to be significantly more fun to me. And secondly, because I now understood how the car kind of saw the world, I could play with that too. So I made this, which is a trap for self-driving cars. Because the car runs on like this combination of rules and sensors, when it encounters a dotted line and a dashed line, like a solid line and a dashed line like this, it thinks it's a dead end running all the way around it. And so it can't move. It's like a kind of demon trapped in a magic circle. Which I just really enjoyed doing to it, basically. Because I think these are two appropriate like responses to that agency and that literacy, right? I can choose to like engage with it and shift it, but there's also like an off button within reach, because both kind of engagement and resistance are totally valid responses to technology kind of being imposed on us in various ways. There's also something, I don't know, the trap's like a super aggressive thing, but it's also about finding a kind of point of communication between the human and the machine. Like, because it was only by understanding how these sensors function in this, I could find something that like both the human and the machine could see together. And this is a thing that means it's legible to both sides. It's kind of a shared space of communication that I really like. So it's not necessarily such a mean thing. It's quite mean. But in both these cases, in order to understand how to do these things, I needed an understanding of how the things worked. And it wasn't easy, but it wasn't impossible. The tools were at hand. And as an artist and as a designer and as a human being, you kind of have to build that literacy in order to gain agency. And you have to largely do it for yourself. The problem is that a lot of people right now don't have either literacy or agency. They don't understand how the world around them works, largely because it's so weird and so complex, and they don't understand how they can do anything about that. And that's a serious problem that won't be fixed by us demonstrating our own agency, but only by increasing that of others. And I would say that this lack of agency, for me it seems, is the primary political and social problem of today. People don't understand what's happening around them, from kind of automated systems to global surveillance to migration to financial collapses. They don't feel they have any way of like engaging with these issues. And the result of that is either apathy or fear, which frequently turns into anger. And I believe that there's a concrete and causal relationship between the complexity of these systems that we're forced to engage in every day and the opacity with most with which most of these systems are kind of constructed and described. And fundamental global issues of inequality, of violence, of populism, of fundamentalism. Right? And at the moment, we're mostly trying to desperately reduce the complexity by increasing the opacity, by making it harder to see, which really, really isn't helping. Because in designing a world that's easy to see, that doesn't require thought, consideration, or criticism, we're actively helping to create this world in which nobody has a chance to learn. So nobody's ever going to have any idea what's going on. We've spent the last 50 years or so, probably more, but systematically demolishing older forms of authority. And to be clear, that's great. I'm all for demolishing authority. But at the same time, we've utterly failed to help people understand those questions for themselves. This right here is a design problem. Here's Google returning 4chan threads as breaking news in the aftermath of a shooting. Here's Facebook seamlessly interweaving racist ideology with updates from your mum. Here's YouTube recommending that I follow Walter Cronkite talking about climate change in 1980 with a crazy conspiracy theorist. And my argument is not that we need to design magic solutions to stop this happening, although that would be nice. We need to help people deal with this when it happens. Because all of these were design decisions that assumed that the best thing was to make it easier for the user. And in a world where everything has been reduced to this kind of seamless flat plane, are we really surprised that people are struggling to understand things? Or that sort of conspiracy theory is the kind of dominant discourse of our time? Because, don't need to hear that. Because conspiracy theory is super interesting, and I think about it a lot. And this is the definition I like. It's from the theorist Frederick Jameson, who calls conspiracy theory a poor cognitive mapping. And what he means is that given how much, these vast amounts of information that are available to us, we find it impossible to shape coherent narratives about what's going on. So to regain agency, to have some kind of sense of control over the world, we tell these simple stories. And they're often worse and more dangerous. And these simple stories include, I feel like, both racist, nationalist, kind of sexist, homophobic narratives of societal collapse, and also reductive fairy tales about free markets and invisible hands and magic machines that just do what they do without any kind of human intervention. And this is a massive problem because the world is complex, right? It's brilliantly, wonderful complex, and this fact is revealed to us all the time by the very technology we use to make it simpler. Whether it's trying to build a self-driving car that can see or understand everything without hurting us, or it's trying to fit all the kind of complexities of personal identity into a little box in a database. We're continually presented with examples of things that are simply not simple at all. And instead of engaging directly with that complexity, we keep trying to engineer it out of existence. We even seem to be encouraging this confusion by making even more confusing things. Right? It's really amazing. It's really amazing that we built a machine that beats us at board games. But the truth is that no one, and I really do mean this, nobody at all really understands how and why that machine did what it did. We trained it, but it made those decisions for itself, and it thinks in ways that we cannot think. And now think what that means when that's not a game of chess, but it's your insurance premiums, your healthcare choices, government policy decisions. Because at that point, saying we don't understand how it does it is not good enough. And once again, I ask, what would it mean to really understand things at this level? And isn't that what we should be trying to encourage? If you zoom out even further, this question, this idea just gets even more strange. Because the problem is the way we're making technology and everything else at the moment, this central paradox, is that access to more information was supposed to make us better, was supposed to make us happier, all this stuff. And it's not what's happening, right? We're now connected to vast, vast repositories of information we can access at any moment. All the content you could possibly arrive at, delivered to you at the speed of light. And yet what we see occurring in the world is increasing fundamentalism, division, fear, and anger. Given the wealth of complexity available to us, people are fleeing to the edges to ever more extreme positions. And this is not something we can just simplify out of existence. We can't just kind of organize it better. Rather, we need to get a lot better at dealing directly with this complexity. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've mostly been thinking about the scary parts. I just wrote a book called New Dark Age, which is specifically about how terrifying a lot of the implications of this stuff is. But I really, really want to think about what we do about it instead. So in the last few minutes, I just want to say like how I'm starting at the very beginning to think about how we answer those questions. First thing that seems kind of necessary, inherent, is like, don't be scared of making things difficult. This picture's from a few years ago in Turkey when the government banned Twitter. And graffiti appeared around Istanbul sharing the IP address. So actually, this is Google's DNS service, which if they changed their settings, they could access again. And when a few years later the government banned Wikipedia, people figured out how to use VPNs and other of these sort of supposedly difficult, awkward technologies. People are a lot smarter than you think, and they'll surprise you. And for years, we've been told that the tools that we needed to kind of protect ourselves online were too difficult for people to use, but that we should have been working. But what we should have been working on is how to explain why these things are important, not making them simpler and therefore harder for people to understand, or trying to sneak them through by kind of encouraging this thoughtlessness in people's behavior, and thus reducing people's criticality and agency. Secondly, I think it's really important to not be afraid of tools that you believe in, even if you think people aren't going to understand them right now, right? Because we shouldn't be using this present use or understanding as a metric. I think of this as laying down duckboards. This is a phrase I keep coming back to, trying to understand what it means. Because the future's going to be rough. The waters are rising, and we're going to need tools to kind of help us get through this. The next billion users you keep hearing about, they're going to be hot, and they're going to be wet, and they're going to be afraid, and they're going to be angry, and their needs are going to be very, very different to the last billion, and pretty soon, so are our own. So a lot of the work that feels necessary right now is preparing for that change, not reinforcing present systems. Thirdly, use things that are difficult yourself. Think about the shape of the tools that you're using, because the shape of those tools matters. Infrastructure matters. The stuff under the stuff matters. You can't talk about kind of decentralizing organizations and empowering people without actually doing it. And you won't do it by using the same old tools that created these problems in the first place. For example, I've been having really productive conversations with people by just getting them to use slightly dodgy video apps that actually do peer-to-peer conversations rather than something like Skype. Because after years of kind of leaks and scandals around information, everyone knows that it's creepy and weird to have all your data on one server belonging to one company. And the sense that it maybe shouldn't be that way, but they have no sense of how to do anything differently, and they don't know that these alternatives exist. Using them and explaining that changes that. And I'm finding that I'm spending a lot more time in communities that look like this, programs that look like this, which scares some people, particularly designers. But it's helping. These, by the way, these are all decentralized apps and processes. They're fundamentally based on shifting the way in which the World Wide Web and the internet at large and all of our information processes are structured. And they're available and they're downloadable to you right now, and they look shonky as hell, and it's hard work to use them. But you learn so much from doing it. Because I keep hearing this phrase, I've just heard it a lot today, and it was bothering me. I keep hearing this phrase, pain point. And it worries me, because it seems to suggest, again, that the role of design is to erase these moments of difficulty, to make them go away, rather than seeing them as moments when we can help each other increase our systemic understanding of the opportunities and risks of the tools that we use every single day. This kind of design that I'm wibbling on about, it's not about making things simple and easy. Simplicity, frankly, is a trap. It obscures things, it fools people, it makes them harder for them to make the right decisions. And in the long run, it just leaves them behind. This kind of design is not about satisfying desires. It's not about enabling people to articulate and address needs. Sorry, it is about enabling people to articulate and address needs, and crucially, to learn how to address them for themselves. By this idea that by introducing a little friction, you could actually transfer a little energy to them. My friend Rachel Caldicott, who runs a digital think tank in the UK called .Everyone, calls this coping, not coding. She says this, she says, as automation continues apace, and data and algorithmic processes reach true ubiquity, legibility will become a human right? Our ability to understand these processes that surround us. Society should care much less about teaching people to code, increasing everyone's knowledge, but concentrate on creating the conditions for more of us to cope. Instead of thinking about how you're helping someone solve a problem, or even teaching them your way of solving it, think about how you're helping them deal with the problem for themselves. As an artist, I'm really trying to switch my focus from pointing at these problems to trying to deal with them. Not crucially to fix them, but to give myself and others the tools to live with them. Because the issues that we face in the present, which I've barely touched upon here and are not going away, and frankly are a lot worse than I've even said, they're complex and they're gnarly, and to even live through them, let alone address them, we're going to need to think in complex ways as well, and we're going to need to do it together. Complexity is not a condition to be tamed, but a lesson to be learned by all of us. It's the condition of life, of our very existence. Our role right now is to help people learn to live with it. And I don't know how to do that yet, but I think it's the only thing worth trying to understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you.